All right, so here we go with Age. This is Howard Hawks' Bringing Up Baby. This is the later Image Turner release, I believe from about 95 or 96 or so. This is essentially what the old RKO collection disc had started to morph into. Unfortunately, they really didn't continue much after this point because this was getting closer to the format's end. But this is the same transfer, well, a transfer of, I believe, the same print source that I recently saw in the theater, which was from the MoMA collection. So this is a wonderful Laserdisc, and currently today it's still my favorite version of the film. I've got a little more than the DVD. Of course, it has cue marks and a little bit of damage here and there, but it looks and sounds wonderful. Much better than the older analog transfers. Right, here's the rear. Pardon, I'm covering up the old dress label. This is one of the other discs I got from my old professor, and I can never get these darn stickers off. So very nicely laid out, very simple, nice design. Actually has some of Baby's leopard coat underneath some of the text, which I thought was a nice touch. Of course, later 90s release, you can tell by the Turner Home logo, which they didn't keep for very long, but nice liner notes, production stills, very straightforward, but nice release. All right, moving on. This is Howard Hawks' Immortal Classic Here's Girl Friday from the Columbia Classics Collection. Nice transfer, PCM mono. Very nice disc. Of course, being an older transfer, the source is a bit worn if you compare it to the new Blu-ray. However, the Blu-ray audio is a little bit on the scrub side, so if you want the best version of the audio track you can get on disc, you're pretty much looking at this guy. Of course, like with all the other Columbia Classic releases, nice liner notes, lobby card, and some production stills, and you got your chapter information. So nice old disc here. Moving on to Hitchcock. This is the CBS Fox release of Lifeboat, CLV with PCM mono. Nice release, even though it's a Fox disc from the late 80s, early 90s, and those can sometimes be only average or so. But nice transfer, much better than the older ones, much better than tape, of course. And nice sounding mono track, so standard CBS Fox style jacket. Got some production stills up here and a little bit of liner notes. Only 3 or 4 chapter markers each side, so like with a lot of Fox discs of that era, you skip a chapter instead of doing a couple minutes, it'll do more like 10 or sometimes 20 minutes. So, but anyway, until their DVD came out, that was the best copy you could get. So here we have Stage Fright from Warner Brothers. This is the remastered Laserdisc version, so it has digital audio, PCM mono. Pretty much the same source as their DVD, and this hasn't come out on Blu-ray yet, so via Warner Archive. So currently this is the best audio track you can get. It's a little bit better than the DVD because they're pretty much the same source, and not too easy to find because most Warner Hitchcock titles were analog only, and this one came out a little bit later, so I got digital sound. As you can see, it's got the standard Warner style back, but they chose some good stills, and I kind of like how the purple works on the back of this jacket with the same purple as the credits here. So really a nice forgotten Hitchcock film. Deserves more credit than it gets. This one I picked up simply because it was cheap. This is Dial In for Murder. Warner Brothers release, of course, uses the original poster art very, very well on Laserdisc. Analog only, though, and it is a 1.33 transfer. It's got a little bit of damage. It was really cheap, so I just got it for the cover and to do some comparisons. Like all the tape releases in the first DVD, it's 1.33. There is some debate on the aspect ratio of this film because it was shown both 1.33 and 1.85 and 1.66, so it's been shown matted. And the Blu-ray release is matted. Of course, the film was famously shot in 3D, and but when it came to theaters, the fad had kind of passed, so it was pretty much only seen flat until the 3D version was restored for the Blu-ray release. So that's a nice release to have as well. But On Laserdisc, this is about as good as it gets. It's not a bad transfer for Warner Brothers Disc at the time, but of course analog only sound, no digital tracks, and it's a little on the soft side, but you know, it's nice to have because the usage of the original poster artwork on the sleeve is just wonderful. So not an essential title to have on Laserdisc, but it has a nice cover at least. If you don't have the Blu-ray, you should grab it immediately. It's wonderful. Same thing here. This is the Paramount CLV release of To Catch a Thief. Same thing, I picked it up because it was cheap and just wanted to see what it looked like. And of course, using the gorgeous original poster artwork is always a bonus. Same thing here. Some nice uses of production stills, but this is, you know, this is bare bones. Again, a little bit soft, analog only sound. And the interesting thing to note about this is the shirt that Cary Grant is wearing in his opening scenes is a striped black and white shirt, very tight little lines, and it wreaks havoc with aliasing on almost any CRT. And it's actually, I read on a forum, it's actually well known, this film is well known among video mastering engineers for having that extremely difficult to process shirt of Cary Grant's. So even the DVDs had some trouble with aliasing, and it wasn't really until the Blu-ray that all that got nailed out, and it was all because of a wardrobe choice. So that's just an interesting little side note. Of course, this is 1:3:3, and this is a VistaVision film, so that's really kind of compromising the intended ratio. But all in all, for such an old disc, it doesn't look too bad. But this is another one where, although it's not perfect and it could be better, the current Blu-ray is the best you can do for the most part. But anyhow, this is another I picked up simply to do some comparisons. This is the MCA Universal release of Vertigo. This is part of their standard Hitchcock line from pretty much the mid-'80s to the before they started doing the reissues with Psycho and then the Vertigo restoration. So they're all 1:3:3 analog sound only. And of course, the Hitchcock titles that reverted back to Universal were sold back. The Lost Five, as they were known, one of them being Vertigo, were all in various stages of extreme disrepair due to not being stored well at all. And when they were theatrically reissued, they were really, really compromised. So what you saw in the theaters, what you got. And this is a video transfer of that version of Vertigo. So again, VistaVision title, and it's presented in 1:3:3, so you are compromising your ratio a bit, but the colors pretty much are what you saw on that 1984, 1983 reissue print, where it was, you know, you had fading problems, you had color problems, you had all kinds of problems because it had been mishandled for decades. This does, however, have the all-important mono mix on those analog tracks. And of course, the film was famously restored in '96, but the studio insisted on remixing it into 5.1 and inserting brand new Foley effects and stuff, which ruins the restoration. Thankfully, the newer Blu-ray kind of goes back and cleans up the restoration a bit, but they didn't let them do a full-on digital restoration, and they remixed the 5.1, so it's better than the '96 one, but they still should have just given us the original mono. So this has the original mono. The 2005 DVD from the Masterpiece Collection DVD box set, the one that had the velvet box, also has the mono, and then everything else either has a fold down or a 5.1 remix. So it's not in the best shape, but you know, if you want to see kind of what Vertigo looked like and when it was reissued in the 80s after it had been unavailable for years, this will kind of show you. It's a little bit soft, but it's not a bad disc. But this is, you know, you're gonna see kind of how bad it looked, or get an idea of how bad it looked before the Robert Harris Jim Katz restoration in the 90s. So got a little bit of liner notes here, but other than that, it's just a standard Universal release. They really didn't, and still to this day do not treat the Hitchcock titles with the respect they deserve, because the Blu-rays are a mix. Some are truly awful, some are okay. It's just kind of a crapshoot. Moving on to MGM's reissue of North by Northwest. This came out after the Criterion release. This is the first letterbox version that MGM did. It's a different transfer than the Criterion, or it may use the same element. It's got a slightly different aspect ratio. VistaVision titles could be mastered in anywhere between a 1.66 ratio all the way up to even a 2.0, or even a little tighter than that. Most titles are usually presented at about a 1.85, sometimes a 1.78 now that we have the 16:9 standard. But it is mastered differently. And overall, as much as I like the Criterion, it can look a little bit on the pasty side. So I do quite like the look of this, and the color timing is pretty darn spot on. Let me show you. It's got their, it's a gatefold. So it's got their kind of standard look of the time. Nice uses of production stills across the top. You got one of the original lobby posters. And here's the original one sheet here. Got some nice liner notes. Here you have your chapter stops. It's CLV, and then side 3 is CAV. MGM was always pretty good about that. If it had to have a third side, they'd usually back up the disc break a bit, so you'd have a full side 3 CAV, since that was, technically better quality. And here's the rear. I love how they use this still from the Mount Rushmore climax, and they use it across the entire side here to give some of the scale across, whether you'd seen the film, knew it well, or had never seen it before. That's kind of a striking image to have across the entirety of the side of the back there. And but yeah, otherwise it's pretty standard. And very important to this release, it does have the original mono mix as PCM on the digital tracks. Unfortunately, though, like Goldfinger, MGM felt it was necessary for some reason to replace the opening titles by Bernard Herrmann, his famous North by Northwest opening title music, with a stereo version from I guess the original stems or something. And while it's nice and the fidelity is great, it's not how you would have heard it in the theater, because despite there being rumors of there being like a Perspecta fake stereo mix for North by Northwest, as there were on other VistaVision titles, North by Northwest was exclusively mono, and the DVDs did a 5.1 remix that carried over onto the Blu-ray. And while it uses the full stereo sourced Bernard Herrmann score, which sounds wonderful, it doesn't fit with the film. It overpowers much of the film, and the mono mix was designed and really suits the film much better. So the mono mix is really important, and for the mono you have to go back to either the Criterion or this MGM release, but to get the opening titles in mono you need to go back to the Criterion. And of course the Criterion did a CAV box, but that was analog sound only. So if you want digital PCM for the Criterion version, you need the CLV disc. So, but this can be had for very cheap, and it's a lovely Laserdisc. It's probably my favorite overall transfer for the film, despite the HD version looking wonderful and being a much higher resolution scan. All right, moving on to John Huston. This is the MGM release of Moulin Rouge. I just recently picked this up, so I haven't got to look at the transfer yet. Of course, has digital sound, the original mono as PCM. And of course, this film was famous for the battle they had with the Technicolor labs, because they had specifically ordered the Technicolor labs, I think it was Technicolor London at the time, to specifically print the film with more browns, and the labs sent back what would be a proper print job, and it wasn't what they wanted at all, so they went back and forth, and Huston and his cinematographer had to fight over and over and over and go through all of these hurdles, because they were trying to recreate something more of what the actual Moulin Rouge would have looked at the time, and according to various paintings and other artworks depicting the Moulin Rouge. So here you have the gatefold, chapter listings in the center, no special features or anything, it's just the film. They do give you the theatrical trailer at the end. I always love how MGM tried to include a trailer if they could, and it's always better if they put it at the end. I hate it when they put it at the beginning. If you haven't seen the movie in a while, if you've never seen it before, and older trailers usually can give away far too much, so it kind of sucks if they put it at the beginning. All right, here's the back, or standard layout. I've taken some artwork from the film and given it kind of tint to it. You have a production cell here, cast list, and liner notes. So I'm interested to see what this looks like. I'm sure it's the same transfer as the DVD, so that should be interesting. Now we have Huston's 1975 masterpiece, The Man Who Would Be King. It's Fox release, letterboxed, I think from about 1991 or so. If you haven't seen this film, do so immediately and don't let anyone spoil it for you. Based on the Rudyard Kipling story. What's interesting about this release, I'll show you the gatefold first. It's actually pretty nice for a Fox gatefold. Here you have the original one-sheet artwork taking up the whole panel, and it's glossily printed, so that actually looks really nice. I love the artwork. I love everything about this film. It's one of those where the less said, the better. It's really, honestly, this is probably the last truly great old-style adventure film. I mean, this really defines the whole concept of the adventure film. So, and you get the typical Fox liner notes, these little blurbs that they would put on some of their releases at this time, especially ones that were long enough to have 2 discs that just do a gatefold. You have your chapters, and of course, as with most Fox discs, the chapters, you only get a couple per side. So there's the back. Same thing, typical Fox design. As far as the sound, you get a digital track. It says it's stereo, but if I remember correctly, it's just plain mono because the film was a mono film, never had a stereo release. So I don't believe it's a stereo remix on here. I could be mistaken. I'll have to spin it up again and double check. The current Blu-ray is lovely. The film was in and out of print for a lot of years, and the DVD was essentially a copy of the Warner Brothers reissued Laserdisc, which came out about '98 or so, which is a lot cleaner than this, but I've never actually found a copy because it's quite rare. But that DVD was a flipper DVD. You had to flip it over just like the Laserdisc, so it was pretty crummy, so it's nice the Blu-ray finally came out. But what's interesting about this, and what makes this disc important, is it has the original American theatrical ending. There's a slight difference in the final climax, just in the sequence of the shots and how it's photographed. I'm not going to go into detail and spoil it for anybody if you haven't seen the film. But if you've ever seen the Warner DVD, the Warner Laserdisc, or the current Blu-ray, that seems to be the British version, and that's what I believe Huston intended. But the original American release had a slightly different way of staging the final climax, some different shots, and a whole different way of running the end sequence. So you can actually see that on here. And then if I remember correctly, once the feature ends, I think it presents like a slightly alternate version of that. I can't remember how they title it. But yeah, if you've never seen this film, definitely go see the Blu-ray or grab the DVD if you can. But if you're a diehard like myself, having that slightly alternate ending, this is the only version I know of that has that, because I think they just mastered it from the American source version or whatever. Transfer's a little bit on the soft side. It's not the best for picture quality, but it was the first letterbox release, and it is very important to get that slightly alternate ending. So, all right, moving on. This is a film I saw a lot in my childhood because my sister was obsessed with it, and I never realized for the longest time that it was actually directed by John Huston, so that was a bit of a surprise. This is, of course, the 1982 version of Annie. It's a Sony Columbia release, so of course that means you get to deal with the lovely DADC plant. Doesn't really have any rot that I've seen, but of course you never know if that could pop up with one of these. Anyway, standard style jacket. You have some liner notes here. You have your chapter listing down here, and they actually have all of the places with the songs highlighted. So that's kind of neat if you want to quickly access those. Digital PCM soundtrack has the Dolby Stereo track, because this is 1982. It did have a Dolby Stereo release, but it's kind of more on the limited side. But it sounds great because it's the original mix. I believe all of the DVDs and the current Blu-ray just have a 5.1 remix. I don't know if there's any differences, but I've heard there actually might be. I know there's some really diehard Annie fans, and I think I've read somewhere there might be a difference. So when I saw this for cheap, I figured why not pick it up. So, and I do love the photography that they achieved here. I think it does kind of harken back to some of the work Houston did on Moulin Rouge, and of course even his photographic experiments later on with Moby Dick. So not bad. And finally for Houston, this is the letterbox edition of Preezy's Honor. Wonderful, wonderful film that isn't talked about enough, and for the longest time it just had a really crummy DVD, which I actually think was just a port of this. So and it just came out on Blu-ray, but it's literally just a port of that old master, so it doesn't really do anybody much good. So I picked this up for pretty cheap, and it's a nice disc. It was actually sealed, so you can never beat sealed. It's an image disc release, has the original Dolby Stereo track as PCM. And you know, it's a nice Laserdisc transfer. It's not the greatest, but you know, it's pretty good. And I don't think, does it have any extra? Yeah, it has a little bit of extra features, a little bit of like a mini documentary piece, and then some of the television spots and trailers. So, and a decent amount of liner notes. So you know, not bad. It's a film that should be talked about more, like most of Houston's work. So. All right, moving on to Kubrick titles. This is the MGM double feature release of Killer's Kiss and The Killing. These transfers are 133 with the original mono tracks as digital PCM. They look and sound great, far better than the VHS versions I first saw them on. And of course, the DVDs that I had for years are pretty much the same master. So those look a tiny bit better, but these sound better due to having that PCM. Of course, they've both now been reissued by Criterion in HD and look great, but of course, The Killing is now presented as 166, just like Passive Glory is on the Criterion release. So you want to hold on to the older versions to have the 133 framing, as Kubrick was notorious for liking different aspect ratios or requesting such things like the multi-aspect ratio on the older releases of Dr. Strangelove and Lolita. And I was so used to seeing The Killing and Passive Glory in 133 that the 166 framing was kind of a bit of a shock. Took some getting used to. So. But this is a very, very nice release, and you get a nice gatefold with the usual MGM usage of production stills and adding some tints to make it more interesting. Get your chapter index here, and then it's nice that each disc is each respective film. Sometimes they would to save space. Sometimes if you had a multi-disc set from MGM with multiple features, it would have one film stop on like side 3 and then the next one automatically pick up. So if you wanted to go to that next film and not watch the other one, you had to, you know, skip through the last 20 minutes of the previous film. So it's nice that each film gets their own disc. And then here's your rear cover, a little bit of liner notes. So not really anything in terms of special features, but you know, this was the first really nice major release of these you know, Kubrick's first 2 full-length features, essentially. Even though Killer's Kiss is technically much shorter, it's still his first feature technically. So now we have the Universal standard letterbox release of Spartacus, the 1999 restored version by James Katz and Robert Harris. Anyway, so it's CLV. It has the restored mix as Dolby Stereo Surround as digital PCM. As far as the sound is concerned, they did 2 versions. They did one for the 70mm prints of the restoration that had as much of the traveling dialogue that they could muster, because Spartacus actually has a enormous amount of dimensional dialogue where it follows the characters across the screen. And there's even sequences where one character will be talking to another in a 2-shot, and their voice will be coming from the left side. And then in the reverse shots, their voice is all of a sudden coming from the right side, because they're now on the right side, because it's the reverse shot. So that confused a lot of people, and a lot of home systems at the time, especially in the early 90s, weren't able to keep up with that with the Dolby matrixing system in the early days of ProLogic. So they made a custom mix for homes and television airings and stuff. So that's what you get on here. That's what was on the Criterion CAV release as well. And then the Criterion DVD got a 5.1 remix that brought in a bit more of the directional dialogue. But it wasn't until the new Blu-ray with the new 7.1 mix that faithfully recreates all of the directional dialogue and the entire full 5-front channel stereo width. If you have a proper home theater setup and you have 7.1, if you listen to the new Blu-ray of Spartacus, you'll actually hear two extra phantom channels in the front. So you'll have your left speaker, your center channel, and your right speaker. But if they're set up correctly, you'll be able to hear phantom imaged those original 2 speakers that created the full 5-channel 70 millimeter 5-channel across the front stage. So you have left, center, right center, and right. And it's actually beautifully done. You'd almost think you had 5 speakers across the front. But anyway, for Laserdisc, this is a very good transfer. It's a little on the soft side. It's not as good as the Criterion CAV because, you know, this is CLV and it was Universal doing their own without any special features just to, you know, make their own 2 cents and also generate something they could use for the VHS release, which sadly was the first version of the film I owned and, of course, was pan and scanned. And I had to sweat and save my hard-earned childhood allowance dollars just to get that. And so I slowly worked my way up. And so this is a nice release to have. It's pretty straightforward, but of course not as good as the Criterion. So there's Spartacus. Now we have the Columbia release of Dr. Strangelove. Letterboxed, of course. I'm pretty darn sure this is the same master as the Criterion. It has the multi-aspect ratios. It alternates between 1:3:3 and 1:6:6:1 on certain shots at Kubrick's insistence. He thought some shots worked better on 4:3 CRTs of the day in one ratio versus the other. Theatrically, it's usually shown at just straight 1:6:6. But I've seen print elements that have hard matted shots, and I've seen print elements that are straight 1:3:3. So there's no end to the debate on the ratios of Strangelove. And the Criterion version of Lolita was also presented that way. So that's another film with his preferred version during his lifetime having the multi-aspect ratios. Here's the rear cover. I do love how they kind of dispensed with the usual Columbia back, and they kind of kept with the original one-sheet poster aesthetic with the red and white. And then you get some nice production stills here, chapter list on the side, and some nice liner notes. But of course, it's nothing like the deluxe Criterion package. So this is just, you know, if you don't have the Criterion, you want a copy of Strangelove on Laserdisc, or you want to see the alternating aspect ratio version, you can pick this up. But it doesn't go for a lot, but it's actually not that common. So, and then Columbia did a lot of DVDs from this same master, and then in 2004 they started doing their restored versions, and that's when it switched to being 1:6:6 exclusively. And their Blu-ray is great, their 4K restoration is great. The Criterion Blu-ray is the same mastered from that 4K restoration, and actually has the original mono, which is great. And it's lossless, but this does have the original mono as well as PCM, and they kind of sound about the same, so I can't really tell which is better or not. But yeah, if you want the alternating aspect ratio and you don't want to pay a lot for the Criterion, you can pick this up. So that's not a bad release. Next we have the original MGM letterbox edition of 2001: Space Odyssey. This is a bit of an interesting disc. I do like the cover art, and this is reused for their box set version. The Criterion release from 1989 was supervised by Kubrick, and they did it to his specifications as best they could at the time. They were having to scan a 35mm source, as they didn't have the technology to scan 65mm elements at the time. However, MGM did this version in, I believe, 91, and this is the first version that was done from a 65mm element. However, somehow or another in the process, the color timing was either messed up or not to Kubrick's specifications, and he was notorious for spot checking even reissue print runs just to make sure that they were up to his, make sure the color timing was correct, or make sure, every last technical detail was correct. So they had to go back, and for the 25th anniversary CAV box set, that was corrected. It was the same transfer, but all the color was corrected, and it looks a lot better. And of course, that box set is full CAV, so this one's only CLV. The sound, though, is very nice because it's the original mix, the original 6-track 70mm mix with directional dialogue intact that was also on the Criterion, simply run through a Dolby encoder, so you can decode it with ProLogic into matrix surround with a mono surround behind you. Obviously not as good as the original 6-track due to that, but it still sounds wonderful. And of course, the Warner versions and the current Blu-ray and all the Warner DVDs are actually a remix that loses all the directional dialogue. So, and also the audio track on this is cleaner than the Criterion. So it's the same on the CAV box. So if you see this for cheap, this is usually a very common cheap Laserdisc. Most people don't have any idea about the differences in transfer stuff, but the Criterion audio has a little bit of high-end damage here and there. This does not, so the audio is actually slightly better on this. So it does have a nice gatefold. They use the background. This is one of the I believe that's the dish of the Discovery. And you have some production stills, the original poster. Kind of spreads you the whole thing. And then you have your chapter listings here. Of course, it's CLV, spread onto 3 sides. Here's the rear cover, which I do admit looks pretty nice. It kind of fits within the standard MGM style of the time. The only thing of note that gets confusing to a lot of people, after the CAV box, they did a last reissue, another CLV one, but it was one of their they just added a 5.1 AC3 track, which is the original mix, but just rendered in 5.1. And it sounds wonderful, but it looks identical to this release. Same cover artwork and everything. The only difference is they added a little black Dolby Digital logo down here. Literally, it's a little square. It looks like almost a sticker just stuck on here. So that can be very confusing. And a lot of times if you try to find that, which is not common, you wind up buying another one of these. However, that disc was replaced by the first MGM DVD, which is very easy to find, and it has that 5.1 track. So you can just grab the DVD if you want to hear the original mix in 5.1, or you want to see what the original color timing looked like, because it's that same master that was fixed for the 25th anniversary CAV box, repressed into the CLV with 5.1, and then that was recycled into that first DVD from MGM. So that's much easier to find. I found mine for 99 cents, so much better than trying to find that AC3 Laserdisc for like 20 or 25 bucks, but there you have it. Next, we have the Warner release of Clockwork Orange. This is is the 1/3 disc? I can never remember. This is actually letterboxed. Some releases are 1/3, some are letterboxed. This one is letterboxed. It's a little bit soft. It's not the best Laserdisc transfer, but it does look very nice. And most importantly, it has the original mono track as PCM. Most later releases have a 5.1 remix, which is just unnecessary. This is a nice Laserdisc to have. This was about the best you could do before the DVD came out, and it is uncut and everything, so you don't have to deal with any censorship issues. And yeah, it's nice to have on Laserdisc. And of course, the film's a masterpiece, so I'm just trying to come up with extra things to say. It's a pretty standard Warner release in terms of jacket and transfer and everything. Unfortunately, all the Warner Kubrick Laserdiscs are not as good as they could be. You wish they were a little bit better. This one actually, though, is pretty nice. This is the reissue of Barry Lyndon, which thankfully uses the entire artwork space, recreating the original poster concept artwork and the winning of 4 Oscars as well. I just love the way this looks on Laserdisc, and using the white background. The rear is the standard Warner style. Of course, there's a little bit of damage. This is probably one of the least common of the Kubrick titles on Laserdisc, at least of the Warner ones. It is letterboxed. It does have the original PCM mono, which is great because for a while we were stuck only with the 5.1 remix. While that's not terrible, the film was mixed and intended for mono, and if you start questioning what Kubrick intended, you're already going down the wrong path. So for the longest time, this was the only way to get the original mono track, and but it is a very nice Laserdisc, especially for a Warner title in the 90s and stuff, and especially a catalog Warner title. So it's nice to have. Now we have the Warner release of The Shining. This is actually a pretty nice disc. It cleans up very well. Of course, it's older. It's 133, and it does have the original mono track in PCM. It can look a bit drab, like Clockwork Orange, for example, can look a bit drab. But I was actually quite surprised when I cranked this up on my HD CRT with my good Laserdisc player, and on my HD CRT, there's an option to disable the red push that's inherent to a lot of NTSC CRTs. This disc actually improves notably. So if you're running a good Laserdisc setup on a modern TV with scalers and stuff, it should look pretty darn good. I was actually quite surprised. It is a little on the soft side like most Warner discs, but if you're able to view it on a really good screen, this actually cleans up pretty well. And it is in that 1:3:3 ratio as opposed to the later releases that had it mounted to 1:7:8, starting with the reissue DVD and then the Blu-ray. So so this is actually a pretty nice disc once you but it is a little bit more equipment dependent. If you're just running it into an older CRT and you had a like middle of the road player, you might wonder what I'm talking about. But it does clean up pretty well, and it is a nice rendering of The Shining. Last we have Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket from Warner. This one's pretty plain, of course, like the others. Kind of keeps that same thing using the original poster art with a white background, give it that nice stark quality. This one I think was printed much earlier because it's much more the older style of Warner logos and things. And I do like how they went with this singular image. Kind of looks like some of the older Paramount discs in that way, instead of the standard Warner Brothers rear jacket. Of course, 1:3:3 rendering of the film as the early DVDs were, so it gives it a different look from the matted versions that you now have on DVD and Blu-ray. Same thing with The Shining. You know, it can look pretty good on better equipment, but it is an older transfer, so don't expect a whole lot. But still, it's nice to have, just to have all of the major Warner releases on Laserdisc. So that's that. Next we have David Lean's The Bridge on the River Kwai. This is from the Columbia reissue series when they started doing, well, they called it the Studio Heritage Collection, but I think it grew out of the Black Label Classics Collection, like you saw in His Girl Friday and others. It is kind of interesting that for this they went with the white jacket instead of the black like they did for most of the classic releases. But this was the 1994 restored version, the first time they went back and tried to clean the picture up. It has the custom sound remix done into Dolby Surround for ProLogic systems. That's actually pretty notorious for having very loud sound effects. If you watched this at all as a kid growing up, you watched it on tape or Laserdisc or even the first DVD, the first thing you notice is that there's nothing seemingly but loud crickets in the background because there's tons of ambient noise and sound effects, and the newer remix is a lot better in that regard. Of course, letterbox, this is a CinemaScope film, and this transfer, the DVD, had it at about 235, so you kind of lost a little bit of the sides, and the Blu-ray restores it to 255, but of course it also restores the full effective CinemaScope mumps, so everybody kind of has that kind of fatter looking face. So it takes a little while to get used to seeing the full 255 CinemaScope version on the restored version. So if you saw this at all growing up or in the 90s, this was the older restoration you're probably more used to. And it's not a bad Laserdisc. Same transfer is used for that first DVD, so you can pick that up as well and get this same soundtrack in 5.1 if you prefer it for some reason or another. But it's not a bad Laserdisc, and it's a nice Columbia release. Get some nice liner notes and the original one-sheet poster. This was really the premiere on video for the 94 restoration. Next we have the MGM standard letterbox release of Dr. Zhivago. Has the original, well, it has a version of the original soundtrack in on the digital tracks, which sounds quite nice. Letterboxed, of course this film was actually shot 35 millimeter, so it's technically a 2:3:5:1 film, a scope film. It was not shot 70 millimeter. That was a way MGM wanted to try and cut costs, so they convinced cinematographer Freddie Young and David Lean to not shoot 70 millimeter, which results in a certain more contrasty look to Zhivago, which honestly gives it a certain flavor in a lot of ways, and just shows off how incredible of cinematographer Freddie Young was, that he was able to make that work. Of course, very straightforward. This is pretty much the same artwork they had on the VHS release at the time. Of course, I forgot to mention, it is a stereo track mixed into Dolby Surround, so to give you a 4-channel version of what people experience on the 70mm Roadshow versions, which had full 6-track stereo surround sound. But of course, those were blow-up prints because this was not a 70mm production. Anyway, this is actually... The transfer is kind of interesting. It's a bit noisy. It's an older transfer. They later did a CAV box in the mid-90s, and then that was reissued on CLV with an AC3 track, just like 2001. And then that kind of moved on to the 2-disc DVD from Warner Brothers. But the sound actually is quite nice on this Dolby Surround track, and the color is very nice on this disc. The picture quality overall, though, it's not the greatest. You may have to squint a little bit. There's not a whole lot of resolution in there, but it is slightly different to the CAV box and then the DVD port of that. So it's nice to have this as a slight alternate. It looks pretty nice, and you can usually get this for dirt cheap. I love the way the Deluxe Letterbox kind of has a actual shiny gold quality to it. It's a little different. So, plus I'm a huge David Lean fan, so I can collect alternates if they're cheap. And last for Lean, we have the MGM release of Ryan's Daughter. This is a truly underrated picture. It got criminally ripped apart by critics on its release from 1970. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful 70mm film. This was the first letterbox release on video. Has the original soundtrack mixed into PCM on the digital tracks, which sounds quite lovely. It's matrixed into Dolby Pro Logic. Originally a 6-track 70mm film, which is 5.1 on the DVD. Of course, the DVD is a lot better because they scanned the 65mm source. This was mastered from a 35mm interpositive. But I actually, despite all that, it's quite a great looking Laserdisc. It can't touch the DVD, but it's nice to have as an alternate. Unfortunately, this film has not come to Blu-ray yet. I think there's some HD bootlegs, but this really deserves a wonderful Blu-ray, and it will look stunning. But this is a great Laserdisc. The DVD is great. If you haven't seen the film, do so immediately. It's not for everyone, but this is just an incredible piece of work. One of those that's definitely the definition of they don't make them like that anymore. But it's a very, very nice Laserdisc too. So now we're moving on to Sergio Leone. This is the rather hard to come by 1998 Laserdisc reissue of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This is still the U.S. theatrical cut, or at least the MGM version of that. There's a bit of differences in the original U.S. theatrical version or international version, which is cut down to about 161 minutes. And this version, which premiered in 1998, has a few slight differences and a couple different shots when compared to the earlier letterbox release that I have in the Eastwood Trilogy box set. Of course, that version has Italian captions for the character freeze frames. This was the first video release to have English captions for those, but it does appear to use some of the same print elements, so it may be a combination of that older print and other sources. But anyway, very nice transfer for Laserdisc. Of course, scope, letterboxed, has the original English mono track as PCM. This is probably the best sounding release I've yet found for the original English mono track. And of course, the 1998 DVD is a port of this, but it does have one shot that's actually different, I think, by a couple of frames. So even that has a few differences. Of course, the important part of this is this was the premiere of the cut scenes that were only featured in the Italian premiere version. It was presented on side 4 as additional footage, but it's in Italian because those were never dubbed into English when the mono track was made back in 1966, 67, when they did the English tracks for United Artists. But on this Laserdisc, they don't have any English subtitles. So unlike the DVD, which presents those scenes as well, you can turn those subtitles on. This one you can't. I don't know if they're in the closed captions or not, but these just play out. But you can pretty much tell what's going on. Spread across 3 sides, transfers much improved over the 91 version, but the 91 version is no slouch either. But it's nice to have this. It's a little hard to track down these days, and of course, currently the new Kino release is yet another messed up release, because even though it says it has the US theatrical version, it actually just has this same variant that MGM had already put out on Laserdisc and then DVD, which is slightly different from the original US and international theatrical release. So calling it that is technically inaccurate. And it uses the extremely flawed 4K restoration with some adjustments that makes some things better, but a lot of things worse. So it's still messed up like the MGM 4K source Blu-ray was. So this release is it's still one of the better ones. There's also the Italian Mondo disc that's now out of print. That's a different transfer that's pretty good but not perfect. So this is yet another one of the Leone classic films that has a very long, convoluted, and troubled video history, and you really need an entire Leone shelf to then try to get something closer to what was intended. But I still have a very soft spot for this international cut. This was the first version I saw, and in a lot of ways I do prefer the shorter version. I miss a couple of the scenes from the longer Italian version, but there were even some scenes that MGM put back in their 3-hour cut that Leone himself had cut out after the Roman premiere. So there's a multitude of versions, a multitude of edits, and you really have to do a lot of research. But essentially it boils down to there's the longer version and there's the shorter version, and one has its pluses and the other has its pluses. So but it's nice to have this, and if you're after the best sounding version of the English mono, you're pretty much going to be looking for this one. But the DVD is a much cheaper alternative if you come across that. Next we have the Paramount letterbox release of Once Upon a Time in the West. I believe it's from '94 or so. Same artwork that they reused for the VHS cover. Interesting. It was a product of the time to kind of have this kind of airbrushed artist rendering style of the characters or the original poster image. So it kind of fits, and it looks quite nice. I do kind of wish they would have used the original poster artwork, but the DVD kind of did a Photoshop job, which was okay, and the Blu-ray has a kind of a more modern treated version of the of some production stills. So all in all, it's not bad. Of course, letterbox bar across the top. Digital sound has the original English mono and PCM. So far to date, this is the best release of the English mono, and you'll find the same exact track on the DVD and the Blu-ray, but they're not lossless encoded. They have the same dropouts and high-end frequency damage as this, so it's the exact same track. So on the Laserdisc, you get it as PCM. And the 5.1 remix, it doesn't make any changes in terms of sound effects for the most part, but it does kind of mess up the levels and balancing of the original mix. So it's another one where they just shouldn't have messed with it. So you just want to stick with the mono. Of course, this is the 165-minute reconstructed version, which pretty much puts it back to what should have come out in the States before Paramount chopped it down to about 130, 140 minutes, losing some really crucial scenes. But Leone himself, wanted to take out a few things, so there are several different versions floating around. There are some versions that can. This version, for example, contains the shot of harmonica rising at the train station, whereas in Leone's preferred version, and in some countries, that scene was omitted, and so Paramount executives hated that idea, and you have to explain everything to the audience as they thought, so they insisted that go back in. So that's just one example of one change that's apparent in different versions in different countries. The only downside with this version, and this is the same cut you find on Blu-ray and the DVD, is that when they did this extended 165-minute version, they mistakenly put the wrong music on the end credits. It's supposed to have Jill's theme and go into the Once Upon a Time in the West credits, and that's supposed to play out for the entirety of the end credits. Unfortunately, it switches to the hang on, I'm having a brain fart. It switches to a different theme. It switches to Cheyenne's theme about halfway through, which kind of changes the whole last note and the last feeling you get from the film in the end credits. Admittedly, it's not the biggest thing in the world. It's not the worst problem to happen to a Leone film, but it's like everything else is perfectly fine. Couldn't they have done a little more research on that? Rear cover, very straightforward, very standard. Got some production stills here. It does have a gatefold, which is actually pretty nice. Excuse the tears on the bottom. When I got this, it's like a spot of glue I couldn't get off, so it was stuck that way. Nice usage of the gatefold here. And you get your chapter listings here. So no special features or anything. It's actually a pretty nice transfer. And this actually is print source, so I believe this was, they took a print of the new 165-minute reconstructed version and transferred it for Laserdisc. So you do get Q-mark changeovers, and it has different color than the DVD version and then, of course, the Blu-ray version. Those must have been mastered from like the new Interpositive or something, but this is a nice release and it gives it a slightly different look. So you can get it for pretty cheap, and if you're as big a fan of this film as I am, it's nice to have that alternate version, and of course has the best rendition of the original English mono. Moving on to Ducky-Sucker, or Fistful of Dynamite as it was still called on this release. This is the older Image version. It was the first letterbox release, and it does have at least a couple minutes added back. So this was the first release to be letterbox and the first release to have any of the additional footage that was cut out by United Artists back in 1971. This film has a very, very troubled production history. It was originally going to be directed by Peter Bogdanovich. Leone didn't want to do it. He was going to produce it, and then he was going to have somebody else do it. Ultimately, he wound up having to take it over himself. It's definitely his most political film. There's a lot kind of reflecting on the political trends and the tumultuous times in Italy at that time in the 70s, and of course stemming from post-World War II. Very, very, very underrated film that never really got a chance when it came out. United Artists pulled it out of theaters after it had come out, and then they reissued it in a heavily cut down version under the Fistful of Dynamite title to try and appeal to fans of the Dollars films. And of course it didn't make any sense because they cut it to ribbons and never really gave it a chance. Anyway, this version, it is sourced from a print. It's about 100, Yeah, 138 minutes. So it's a little bit over 2 hours. So this was the first time you could see it with some of the additional footage. It is very soft. The picture quality is not very good on this. It'll look very washed out. But for the time, it was just fantastic to see any extra stuff. Has the original English mono track as PCM. Of course, this film did have some censoring on its soundtrack. The English mono has some cursing and such, and this version has some of it, and then it has some of it censored out or with different lines. So I think what happened is when they reissued it as Fistful of Dynamite, it was also done on double bills and also aimed particularly at children for some reason. And this is not really a film for children. If you know anything about it, or anything about the Mexican Revolution at all, it's not really what you'd say was a real children's film. As you see, it still carries the PG rating on this release. So this is kind of a hybrid. Later on, when MGM did their reconstruction for DVD, and now that's come out on Blu-ray and the Kino reissue Blu-ray, they mistakenly still use an even more censored version of the English. And they did a 5.1 remix, which is just not any good. So if you want to hear it completely censored, then you can pick up the MGM release. So I don't know how that happened. Interestingly, though, the next one I'm going to show you was even more put back together. That was actually their restored MGM release, but for some reason the final line of the main character Juan is missing on that one, and for some reason it's actually present on this one. So that's just a little oddity. That's another reason why you might want to pick this one up, simply because it has an additional line that's supposed to be there. This film has not had an easy history. Here is the 1996 MGM Deluxe Letterbox reissue. It's listed as being uncut. This is still probably the best overall release of this film in this country, which is quite sad. But really all it's missing is the final flashback, which is about 2.5 minutes. But of course that's crucial to the film, and the fact that it's missing still hurts it horribly. And it still carries the Fistful of Dynamite title. Eventually that was replaced with Duck You Sucker, which was Leone's intended English title on the MGM DVD that restored that final flashback, but unfortunately caused a lot of audio problems due to the 5.1 remix and using the censored audio, and there's some color timing issues and so on and so forth. But anyway, so aside from missing that final flashback and the final line, which is dubbed over a last close-up before the end credits that's on the image release, aside from those two qualms, this is absolutely fantastic. It's a phenomenal Laserdisc transfer, great color. All the problems from the image release are gone. The original English mono is here as PCM, and it is fully uncensored, so you get the F-bombs and you get the handful of curses that are throughout, none of which are gratuitous. They work very well within the film. And you see this version carries the R rating, so as far as I can tell, I think the original release in the United States was rated R, and then the cut down Fistful of Dynamite got a PG. So I think that's where the censoring first came into place. You get some liner notes, a little bit of mention about this containing more footage. You see right here 20 minutes more of additional footage, so it has 20 minutes more roughly than the image version. This is about 156 minutes, and the MGM Fuller reconstruction that puts the flashback back is usually credited at 157, 158, so this is almost complete. And this came out on DVD, this particular master, in Region 2, so you can pick that up, but unfortunately it's in PAL and has PAL speed up. But I still think it's better than the later MGM version, and it has better color at least, and it has the uncensored soundtrack. You can also pick up, there's an Italian Blu-ray, but that has a whole host of transfer issues, and it does have the English mono. It has the Italian mono as well, but the English mono goes off sync. The color's not very good. It's very washed out, very contrasting, so you still can't catch a break. And of course, now that Italian disc is out of print, it's been reissued, recolor timed, and has even more problems. So again, you can't catch a break, especially with this film. The Kino disc simply repackages the MGM master that was put out on Blu-ray. That's their reconstructed full version. It does add back the 2.0 track from the original special edition DVD, but that's merely a fold down of the 5.1 and not the original mono. So, and of course, they changed the title back to Fistful of Dynamite for some unknown reason, so there's that too. So essentially, if you really want to have this film in the best quality possible, you need to have every American release for the extras, the commentaries, but all in all, this Laserdisc release is still probably the one to beat, even though it's missing the final flashback and line of dialogue. So again, you can't catch a break, but it is a masterpiece. It should be seen, and it deserves a better reputation. Now we have Leone's final film. This is the Warner Brothers letterbox release of Once Upon a Time in America. It's a standard Warner's jacket. Of course, an exceptionally long film. This is the full original theatrical premiere version that now they've actually restored another 20-25 minutes of sequences that played, I think, at the premiere at Cannes. I can't remember if that played as a premiere or if it was only in test screenings. But this is the 229-minute version that was available eventually on tape, Laserdisc, and then the DVD and of course Blu-ray before they did this new version sponsored by the Film Foundation and Martin Scorsese. But of course, the additional footage they put back in is very degraded, and it only looks so good, and it's kind of distracting in a lot of ways. I personally actually do still prefer this 229-minute version. I think it flows a lot better. Sure, some of the things they put back in explain some things a bit more, but this film is notorious for how labyrinthine it is and how it goes in and out of sequence, just in a fluid motion, and nothing is told in a typical narrative way. And the real shame was Warner Brothers originally, when this came out, they cut it down and then they cut it into chronological order and ruined it. And thankfully, a lot of critics and the public at the time, there was a big outcry about it, and Warner's eventually just kind of tried to get this 229-minute version. They dumped it into theaters and they put it on home video, and thankfully it stayed that way. But I think that harmed the film, and it never got the reputation it deserved, because this is a true piece of work. Let me show you the back. Very straightforward. You can get this for very cheap. You know, Warner's didn't put a whole lot into it, so you would think. Spread across 4 sides. Of course, an exceptionally long film. It's all CLV. But the really interesting thing is it's a mono film. So all of the successive releases are in 5.1. They're all remixes. The original mono track on here is much better. The 5.1 essentially just spreads the mono around the room, and it's still essentially mono, but in a 5.1 field. But what's really interesting about this disc is, especially on a good setup, the video transfer on this is staggeringly good. This is probably one of the at least the 10 or so best looking Laserdiscs I've ever seen. Most of the time you'd swear you're watching the DVD from 2003, where they spread it onto 2 discs to preserve the video bit rate. They're the same master, and the master on this is just incredibly good. Like I said, it's one of the 10 or so best Laserdiscs I've ever seen. I was completely shocked when I put it on. I expected a typical looking Warner's disc with a lot of noise, or kind of hazy, or very soft, and I figured, you know, it wasn't going to look anything like the DVD or anywhere near as good, but it actually does. I'd say throughout the entire, you know, almost 4-hour feature, maybe a tiny bit of aliasing here and there, about maybe 2 or 3 times. And for something this long and all CLV, that's saying something. So if you've never seen this film, or it's been a very, very long time and you're getting into Laserdisc, you can pick this up for nothing. Literally just a couple bucks. Fantastic Laserdisc, and it's the only release to have the original mono mix, and it's losslessly encoded. So that's practically the only film that doesn't have a whole ton of issues. Now we're moving on to Ernst Lubitsch. This is the 1939 masterpiece Ninotchka, probably Garbo's most famous film. reissue disc from MGM. This adds PCM mono. They had released it several times due to its popularity earlier on analog-only disc stuff. But this is actually quite nice. It has an actual gatefold. And as you see, Garbo laughs. Here's the whole gatefold here. And then you get your chapter stops. They do add original trailer, but other than that, no special features or anything. But it's a nice release that you can pick up for pretty cheap, and it's a great transfer. So this, of course, was the best you could do before DVD and the Blu-ray that Warner now has out, which is also very nice. But it's nice seeing this on Laserdisc, seeing everything from print transfers back in the day, and done the best they could, as opposed to seeing some of the older discs or seeing it on tape. But yeah, it's a very nice release. I love the way they printed this. It really gives off that vibe of the old silver screen with this silver printing on the front. So it's a nice release for something that could have just been a standard jacket. And I also have MGM's release of, which is probably, I think, his absolute masterpiece. I think this is his best. It's certainly my favorite. 1940's The Shop Around the Corner. Same thing, print transfer. Very, very wonderful. Different source from the DVD, so it does have a bit of damage. There is a bit of noise on the audio track, but nothing that you wouldn't hear on a vintage print or a reissue print if you saw it at an art house theater. The original mono track in PCM. I'll show you the back. This doesn't have a gatefold, but it's nicely put together. It has some classic vintage materials that play before the feature. If I remember correctly, it's like one of those MGM fluff pieces. It's not a newsreel, but it's one of those MGM fluff pieces. It's basically about, oh yeah, it's another Romance of Celluloid. That's basically where they would talk about some process of, part of the process of filmmaking, and it would eventually just turn into nothing but marketing upcoming MGM titles for the year. And then it has the extended trailer for the film, which actually has the actors talk directly to the audience and introduce their characters in the film. So it's one of those old style participatory trailers, and it's really nice that they put that on here. So a little bit more effort went into this than some of the regular classic releases, but you know, other than that, it's a nice transfer of a great film that more people should be aware of. Moving on to George Lucas, we have the letterboxed release of THX 1138 from Warner. And of course, if you know anything about this film, Lucas went back in 2004 and made his director's cut. So this is the only way to see a proper release of something resembling the original version. When it was released in 1971, Warner Brothers took control of the film, took it over, and did some editing changes and tweaks and took a couple things out, and that's what spurred Lucas to never surrender any control possible ever again. So then after the success of Star Wars, he got the film re-released in 1978, essentially putting back those one or two things, but all the differences and the list of differences is really more rumor. There's very little hard evidence because you can't even see the 1978 version anymore, which I'm pretty sure this is the 78 version. This is the first version I saw. This is what most people are familiar with, but you can't even see this anymore. All you can see is his CGI enhanced, well, actually I would say CGI destroyed director's cut, which ruins the color timing, ruins the photography, ruins the sound mix. Everything is up to 5.1 with brand new effects, brand new CGI all over the place, and it's just a mess. In a lot of ways, it's worse than any of the special editions for Star Wars. And yes, there are multiple special editions for Star Wars, and there's practically not a film of his that he hasn't gone back and done something to. So that's why this is very rare, and usually it goes for a pretty high dollar. I eventually got a good deal on this, but of course it's just a standard Warner jacket. It does have the original mono mix as PCM, so that's great. this is the best and only release of this film. This is what you need to go for. Versions floating around online are usually old Laserdisc rips of this particular disc. There's a Japanese version, but it's pretty much just the same master as this. Of course, there's some print flex in here, and there's some damage in here because it was a print transfer. But it was pretty good for the time. Of course, nobody knew that we'd be stuck with this all these years later. So, very important release of one of the great science fiction films, a masterpiece, and extremely important. And yeah, you have to have this one. You really do, because the director's cut is just terrible, and in a lot of ways it undercuts the entire meaning of the film. Moving on to American Graffiti. This is the Universal letterbox release from the early 90s, I think maybe 92 or 93. It has the stereo remix that was done for I think it was the 1978 theatrical reissue. Originally the film was done in mono, and they remixed it into stereo, I think actually a Dolby stereo track, for that 78 or 79 issue after the success of Star Wars again. Of course, this was the last release to not have the opening titles redone digitally. That was done for the Signature Collection, which was then ported to the DVD and then the successive Blu-rays and stuff. So this is the last version you can get without CGI tweaks applied to American Graffiti, of all things. You think there's nothing that you could tweak in there, but of course it's been done. Get some nice liner notes. It did get a THX mastering stamp, so they glanced at it at some point, I suppose. And of course, Dolby Surround Stereo, digital PCM, so it is that, apparently that 1978 stereo remix. I don't think they changed anything. I think they just wanted to bring all the music source cues and everything into stereo as opposed to mono. I've never actually got to hear the mono because this is the oldest version I could possibly find, and short of obtaining an original print, either 16mm or 35mm, or maybe finding an old VHS copy or beta copy or CED copy that had the mono, this is as authentic as you can get. So pretty nice transfer. Of course, not as good as the later one, but of course this does not have the altered CGI opening, so that's the reason why you want to pick this up, and it's pretty cheap. All right, moving on to the great Sidney Lumet. This is his 1965 masterpiece, The Hill. This is a brilliant, beautiful black and white widescreen movie. This was the first letterbox release from MGM. They did a very nice job on it. This is actually still sealed. I haven't got a chance to take a look at the transfer. I first got to see it on DVD. It didn't come out on DVD till like the mid-2000s, so it was took a very, very long time because this film is not well known at all, and it really should be. Among film circles it is, but it's really one of his best. It's a very, very, very brilliant, very hard to watch film, and I honestly think it's probably Connery's best dramatic performance. Lumet always seemed to be able to pull out some of his best heavy-hitting dramatic performances, and this really, really shows off his acting chops incredibly well. Rear cover here, get some liner notes, and of course the original mono track is on the digital tracks as PCM. Sounds great, better than the DVD because that's of course 2.0 Dolby Digital. And yeah, it is a gatefold, but it would take me a minute to open it. So, all right, moving on to 1982's The Verdict. This is another masterful picture that I wish was better known in this day and age. This is the film that Paul Newman was famously nominated for the Oscar, and everybody thought he would win. And of course, it was in the year of Gandhi. So then later on Color of Money, everybody thought that he won the Oscar for Color of Money as more of a concession prize for not winning it on The Verdict, which he should have. This is probably the performance of his career, I think, at least. It's just incredible. And of course, a courtroom drama from the guy who made 12 Angry Men is certainly not going to be a waste of your time. Just incredible picture that, you know, no one makes anything like this anymore. Letterbox release from Fox. A little bit of damage here. It's tough to find this disc in good shape because when it was first released, there was an error that caused the first Laserdisc with the same cover and catalog numbers to be missing a couple minutes. So if you pick this up, you have to actually put it in and go to a certain point on, I believe, side 2. And if it has the characters in a train station, then you're perfectly fine, and it's the corrected version. All the information's on the disc page on LDDB for this release. So you have to actually be very careful. I think the catalog number may be slightly different, but you have to actually check the discs inside. It has the original mono mix as PCM. There's a stereo remix on the DVDs and Blu-rays. It does have the mono, but this sounds better as it's not... as it's losslessly encoded. Nice picture transfer for a Fox disc later on from the 90s, so they got pretty good at making letterbox transfers. 1.85 to 1. Does have the theatrical trailer at the end. Not really much in special features or anything, but still a very nice release to have of a great film. Here's Lumet's Stranger Among Us letterbox release. Has the original Dolby Stereo track on the as digital PCM. Very straightforward, standard release. Of course, from Hollywood Pictures, so this is technically a Disney disc. As you can see, very similar to other Hollywood or Touchstone releases on Laserdisc in terms of the layout. Just been picking up various Lumet titles when I find them on Laserdisc. Even some of the lesser ones, because he had such a prodigious work ethic that some were better than others. Here is the letterbox release of Guilty as Sin. Very, very similar in cover design. Has the Dolby Stereo track as digital PCM. Very straightforward, similar rear cover. Another Hollywood Pictures release. Again, technically a Disney disc. So we have that. Moving on to Sam Peckinpah, here's the MGM letterbox release of the masterpiece Ride the High Country, one of the all-time great westerns from 1962. Print transfer on this one, so you do get cube lips and stuff. It is a little bit contrasty, and the color, it's not really faded, but it does look different to the DVD and the beautiful Warner Archive Blu-ray release that was, I think, from a 2K scan. So this is more vintage in feeling. Kind of the flesh tones are a little bit washed out with a slight twinge of pink. You might recognize that sort of look from a lot of earlier analog video transfers. So, you know, it does kind of have that slightly worn, very analog feel to it. So it's nowhere near as pristine as the DVD or the Blu-ray, but it's still nice to have. Has the original mono mix as PCM on the digital tracks, so it's nice to have that stuff analog only. Standard style MGM rear cover. Here's the original poster, one sheet here. Nice release. You know, this was the first to really give this film, you know, a good letterbox transfer because it really deserves it. Seeing this film in pan and scan, or any Peckinpah film for that matter, but this one especially uses the scope frame to really give epic sense of the landscape, and seeing this film in pan and scan is a travesty. So next we have the 1995 Warner Brothers letterbox release of Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch. This was the original director's cut version, or so that's how they proclaimed it, but it was put back together in 1994. They put back the 10 or so minutes that had been cut out of the theatrical version, all of the great character quiet scenes that Peckinpah had intended to be there that really hurt the overall meaning of the film. No real violence was ever cut out, which is what you'd think would have been cut out, but it actually wasn't. It was all the quiet character moments that were put back in. Famously, when it was resubmitted to the MPAA for the 25th anniversary re-release in 94 and 70 millimeter, it was slapped with an NC-17 rating because the film had not launched one iota of power, and the rating boards are all stupid and shouldn't even exist, but you know, Anyway, that's always my favorite MPAA story, and Warner Bros. Had to challenge it, being a 25-year-old film originally rated R, and no violence had been put back in, just quiet character scenes, so thankfully that was finally overturned. The film was given back its original R rating and played in 70mm houses. The film was blown up to 70mm on the original release, and it had a stereophonic mix, which has been recreated in 5.1, and which is now on all the successive DVDs and Blu-rays. And this also has a PCM matrixed version on the digital tracks, which also sounds very nice. The film also had a mono mix for regular 35mm prints. That's on the old analog-only pan and scan disc. There's also a Japanese letterbox release from the early 90s. I've never been able to track down, but apparently it also has the mono. But apparently it also has some damage here and there. But as soon as I can track that down, I'll know for sure. But anyway, this is a nice release. There's a big box set version that has some CAV sides, some special features, and a copy of the soundtrack on CD. Unfortunately, that soundtrack release is only in mono. Now there's a Film Score monthly 3 CD release, which I'm really hoping to get soon. I hope it doesn't go out of print, but it's a really nice release of Jerry Fielding's score. Here's the back. Very straightforward, simple, regular Warner Brothers jacket, no gatefold. I really wish it did have a gatefold because it really deserves it, but I do like the rear cover artwork. You get your chapter listings here. It's 3 sides, all CLV. But yeah, this is a nice release. You can pick this up for very cheap. The box set is very hard to find and very expensive, but it's the same transfer overall. There's a little bit of aliasing in the transfer, but it's not bad. There's also a tiny bit of edge enhancement because that was really starting to ramp up in the mid 90s. But it's not bad. It's a nice release for 95, and this same master was recycled for the first DVD, which was a very early DVD. That was actually a flipper. You had to flip it over to watch the last 45 minutes. So it was one of those very early DVDs. It was clearly a recycled Laserdisc. So if you see this, you could pick it up for cheap. It does have a slightly different look to it in comparison to the DVD special edition, which in turn looks slightly different to the Blu-ray version, which is a HD scan. So, and I'm hoping that it comes out in 4K at some point, as the Blu-ray itself is rather outdated. It'd be nice to see this in a beautiful 4K restoration version that not only had the 5.1 recreation of the 70mm track, but also had the original mono mix as an alternate. And the only other thing is a lot of European prints actually had an intermission put in. The film's not that terribly long, but like the Guns of Navarone, some release prints had an intermission, and on the Guns of Navarone release, at least on the Blu-ray, you have the option of playing it with the intermission put in, and it's seamlessly branched, and it has the score that was supplied for it and the intermission title cards, which are quite nice. So it'd be nice to see that on a 4K release as well, just to make it truly definitive. So there's that. Now we have the 1971 masterpiece Straw Dogs. This is a very underrated film, a very tough film to watch, a very notorious film, but it really does have great merit, and I do think it's still criminally underrated, but it is a definite piece of work. Letterbox release from Fox. This was one, well, I think it was pretty much kept uncut on a lot of video releases. There were some where it was censored down, but I think for the most part it didn't have a whole lot of censoring on many releases. I may be remembering that wrong. I do know some were censored, but this is uncut. I do believe it also has an isolated score on the analog tracks. You get a good amount of liner notes. It's actually a nice release from Fox, but aside from the tiny Fox logo on the front and back, you actually wouldn't know it's a Fox release because this was done under the ABC banner. It's changed hands a whole lot of times. Criterion did the first DVD release, and they lost the rights, and then MGM did their own DVD, which was the same master, and then they did the first Blu-ray, and now that's gone back to Criterion, and it's gone through several British labels, so it's kind of hodgepodged and jumped around like other films that were picked up by ABC or done by ABC, because then if ABC went to Disney, so now Disney has their hands on some of them, the way they had their hands on some of the Hitchcock titles and Selznick titles that were Hitchcock titles that went under ABC on VHS, such as Rebecca, Notorious, Spellbound, and then turned up on everyone from Criterion to Image DVDs to Criterion again to MGM. They're all over the place. Anyway, that's Straw Dogs. Not an easy Laserdisc to find, but actually a very good transfer, and has the original mono as PCM. There's a 5.1 remix, but don't bother with it. The mono is much better. Yep, score on the analog tracks, so that is nice. It does have the isolated score on one of the analog tracks. So next we have Warner's letterbox release of the 1972 version of The Getaway with Steve McQueen and Ali MacGraw. Sorry for the creasing. I actually picked this up sealed, and with these Warner discs that have 2 or 3 discs just shoved in a sleeve without a gatefold, especially if they still have the plastic wrap on them, I mean, they're just bound to get ring wear and all kinds of creases and stuff simply because you got the discs in here and they're loose by themselves. But this is actually quite nice with the original poster artwork recreated and a very nice glossy sheen to it, which really isn't typical for a Warner disc. I was quite surprised when I took the shrink wrap off. I'm really sad that it's got all this creasing, but I got it for nothing. And this is not an easy disc to find. Still glossy on the back, which is nice. Production stills, a little bit of info, and you have your chapter index here. It does include the original trailer, which is nice. Some Warner just have the trailer, but a lot don't. Warner was not one to do a lot of features or even trailers on standard movie-owned releases. I believe side 3 is CAV, so it's they were nice enough to do that. But it is a nice release and has the original mono, so that's always helpful. But it's a very nice release. You can get it if you hunt for it, but it's not the easiest Warner title to find. It's got a lot of great moments, but I do think it's one of those films he made more for the monetary value or to have a commercial success. So, speaking of commercial success, that did not happen with this film rather notoriously. This is MGM's letterbox release of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. This was the first major release on video or disc of any type of Peckinpah's own personal cut that was only used as previews before MGM took the film from him and mutilated it for their awful cut-down theatrical release version. And that's what everybody saw, and then everybody wondered what the heck the film was supposed to be about anyway, because, it didn't make any sense, and it got panned and forgotten very quickly, and further wrecked Peckinpah's career. But this version first appeared on, I think, the Z channel in Los Angeles, and it was apparently the print that Peckinpah himself smuggled out of MGM and hid in his garage for all those years. So that's why this is actually directly print source. I think it's from that same print. It has a couple soundtrack differences from the theatrical cut, most notably in one major scene. Dylan's song "Knocking on Heaven's Door" was composed for this film. In one particular scene in this version is played without any words. It's done as an instrumental, and it's wonderful. And then later on, for the DVD release of this, Warner Brothers released a 2-disc set that has this version from this same master with all of the defects and the cue markers, same print, same master and everything on one disc. And then the other was a recut done by Peckinpah aficionados and experts that added some of the elements of the theatrical cut and has a new color timing. It was a new HD scan, so it's really its own thing. But that in that same scene, in that version, it actually has the knocking on heaven's door with lyrics. So You'll want that DVD to have, you know, the couple little bits from the theatrical version and the different audio effects, and then that scene with the actual song on there. But of course, the theatrical version only came out, I think, on VHS tape, and that has some stuff exclusive to that, so they really should have also included the 1973 theatrical version as well. So hopefully, I think Warner Archive is going to do a Blu-ray release of this, and it'd be really nice to have this version fully restored and the theatrical cut fully restored, and all of the bits and pieces that were in one or the other are not in any version, you know, presented as bonus features. So anyway, if you haven't seen the film before, go with this one. I think this is the best version of the film. I think it's a masterpiece, but it's, you know, it's certainly its own beast. It's a very dark film, and it's it's not really happy. To put it bluntly. This is a very nice release from MGM. It's a later release. Has a nice gatefold, as you can see here. You get your chapter listing here. Nice usage of the production stills across the gatefold. Give it some scope and scale. I wish this film was more talked about because it really is an incredible piece of work. Here's the back. Has the original mono track as PCM, so that's always helpful. Not really any special features per se, but it was really important to have this being really the only representation of what Peckinpah's director's cut would have been. He never really got to make a final director's cut. This was just his, essentially his assembly version that he had to then smuggle out of the studio and hide in his garage for 20 years. And it was only after his death that they pulled it out. And like I said, it first appeared on the Z channel, and then MGM made this Laserdisc. So this is really the first good release of this film that you can actually start to see what Peckinpah's intent was. And it's really a great American classic. So moving on to another film that was horribly mistreated on its original release and is finally gaining some acceptance is Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, another letterbox release from MGM, later 90s release. Not easy to find. I was actually quite happy to find this. There's now a really great, several great Blu-rays from either Twilight Time or Arrow over in the UK that use the same HD master and have some nice extra features. But this is a great transfer, completely uncut, has the original mono mix on the digital tracks as PCM. Nice usage of original poster artwork. The DVD was a HD upgrade of this same master, and then that kind of got spun up into the Blu-rays. I first saw this film on DVD. I'd wanted to see it for years, and could never find it, and then it was only pan and scanned on tape, and that was just, I'm not going to do that, especially not with a Peckinpah film. I can't stand any pan and scanning whatsoever. Very simple rear cover. You get your chapter index here. I want to say this has an alternative track. I can't remember for certain. I wanted to say this might have an isolated score or a commentary, but I think that, yeah, the commentary was done for the DVD. So this does not have commentary or anything, but it was great to actually have this properly letterbox for the first time with a great transfer and uncut and everything. But this is a great film. Don't let anybody tell you it's cheap exploitation garbage crap, because it isn't. It's a real piece of work. It's pure Peckinpah. It's undiluted, and it is completely full of really deep emotion. It is a great film that at least finally is getting a better reputation in this day and age. Moving on to Arthur Penn. This is the Pioneer Special Edition of The Chase. Of course, being a Pioneer Special disc, you have their banner with the gold logo writing and the little gold bar. Credited as being limited availability, digitally remastered, widescreen. Of course, pressed by Pioneer, being a Pioneer edition. I quite like how they kept this on all of these discs. You know, a similar... well, not actually identical so they all go together on a shelf very well, and they look nice side by side. And then later releases would just be, you know, whatever the artwork from the studio that the film was from at the time. So I think the Chase was actually also reissued later on Laserdisc, but it didn't come with the Pioneer banner. So I was quite happy to pick this up. And they all have the similar rear panel with this same design, sort of a off cream white background, some liner notes about the film, some stills with your chapter listings. Nice transfer, not bad. But of course, this is now out on Blu-ray, so that of course is really nice to have. But this does have the original track, mono tracks PCM, so it always helps. And anytime I see a Pioneer Special Edition, I grab it because I just love the cover, and I like having them all on the shelf. Even though some were surpassed by better versions on Laserdisc or DVD later on. All right, now we have the incredible Bonnie and Clyde. This is the Warner Letterboxd edition. It's kind of hard to find the Letterboxd edition because the cover of the older pan and scan disc is almost identical. The only way to tell is the photos in color on the widescreen edition, and of course it has the little widescreen edition moniker that you have to always scan for. And this does have the original mono track as PCM, which is very important because even the restored DVD and the restored Blu-ray only have the mono as a lossy Dolby Digital track, which is a real shame. So if you want the best rendering of the audio, you have to get the Letterboxd Laserdisc. It's a very good transfer for the time. It was recycled for the snapper case DVD. So of course the color's going to look a bit different from the restored HD version. If you saw this growing up on tape or disc or television broadcast or TCM, you were seeing this master, so it might look a little familiar. Of course, the new HD master is breathtaking to look at. It looks wonderful. It'd be great if it came out in 4K, but there's always something to be said to see what an older transfer pulls out. And of course, this has the best rendering of the original mono in PCM, so it's nice to have for that. But you want to be careful to not accidentally get the pan and scan version without the PCM. Moving on to Sidney Pollack. This is the Paramount Letterboxd release of 3 Days of the Condor, one of the great classic 70s conspiracy thrillers. It's actually a quite nice release. It's got a very nice transfer. Digital PCM track. The film was from 1975, so it should be mono, but when I played it back on my system, there was a few instances of almost like a stereo type separation. So I don't know if this was like one of those stealth stereo remixes. It's not credited as being such, but it does kind of have some stereo-ness to it. I don't know if that's how the original mix is, if it's slightly remixed into stereo, like for example Warner Bros. Would do with a lot of films. They would do a fake stereo version, or if there was a stereo track that was used in test markets or something, because that was done infrequently. But Dolby Stereo was first tested. The first film that was released with it was actually the 1976 A Star Is Born, not Star Wars as most people would believe. But so that's an interesting thing I noticed when I watched this particular transfer. But it's a nice transfer. Of course, the films come out on DVD and Blu-ray, and there's actually a really nice, I think the better Blu-ray is I think it's on the Masters of Cinema label from Eureka in the UK. But the Paramount Blu-ray is also now back in stock. But I do like having this on Laserdisc because you get a nice usage of the original poster artwork with the wonderful Paramount widescreen cover. I always love how they use the black bars on the top and bottom that actually underline the fact this is widescreen and you are going to get the black bars. And I just love how they kept that on all their Letterboxd releases to give it a nice uniform look. I like it when things go together. So there's that. Here is the MCA Universal release of Out of Africa. Unfortunately, it is 133, which means it's opened up slightly from the 185 original version. It does have a little bit more on the top and bottom, but with any of these, it can be pan and scan from that 185. It can be opened up a bit and you lose some on the sides. It's a bit on the hazy side, but it does have the original Dolby Stereo track as PCM, which is nice. And I picked this up because it was cheap, and I wanted to hear John Barry's score in its original mix instead of 5.1, and also the Universal Blu-ray of Out of Africa, even though it's part of their big anniversary restoration line, actually is full of digital noise reduction and has far too much grain removal. So I found this in the dollar bin once, so I figured why not try it. It's a nice transfer for what it is. One wishes it would be letterbox, but the sound is quite nice. So there's that. Next we have the Paramount release of The Firm, letterboxed. Of course, this is a rather common title. I'm sure a lot of people have this. Of course, you have the original poster artwork, which looks quite nice on Laserdisc. It's a nice transfer for the time. Paramount 90s release of a 90s film, so anytime a film was brand new, they would give it a really nice Laserdisc transfer. Has the Dolby Stereo track and PCM matrixed for ProLogic systems, so no 5.1 remix. This film pretty much, well, I mean, it did come out in the era of 5.1 because 93 and Dolby Digital Premiere did 92, but most films of this era were still primarily intended to be played back in Dolby Stereo or Dolby Stereo SR at this time. So they could have had 5.1 tracks made or not, but this sounds very nice, and it doesn't really require 5.1, I don't think. And it's a nice Laserdisc. It's one of those commons you can find for pretty cheap, and got this one in really nice shape, so not a bad release. Same here. This is Pollock's remake of Sabrina from '95. Letterbox edition, pressed by Pioneer, another Paramount title. Pretty straightforward. I believe this one does have AC3. Yeah, this one does have Dolby AC3 in addition to the PCM Dolby Stereo Surround. Not a bad transfer. Actually, surprisingly, a better film than you'd remember, but not necessarily necessary, especially if you've ever seen the 1954 Billy Wilder version, which in and of itself is beautiful to look at, but there are moments of that don't quite work. It had a troubled production history, so the fact that they decided to remake it was somewhat justified, but it is a bit dated, being from '95. But it's a nice Laserdisc, and you can pick it up for nothing. It's another one of those you can pick up that you have a pleasant rewatch with. Moving on to Scorsese, this is the MGM Deluxe Letterbox release of Raging Bull. This is a very nice transfer, very nice usage of original artwork, and I love how they printed the Deluxe Letterbox tag in silver instead of gold. I think it really goes with the package design. Of course, Raging Bull is also out on a nice CAV Criterion release, but this is actually, I think this one came out a little bit later, and I'm pretty sure with most MGM discs compared to the older Criterion ones, these are usually a bit technically better, a bit cleaner. They had more expensive hardware, and they would have access to higher generation materials sometimes, or sometimes they would just recycle the same transfer, but it would be pressed a bit better because they would use their regular disc pressing plants and stuff. So here's the gatefold. You get your chapter listings here. Original theatrical trailers included. No special features, but nice usage of production stills. Here's the rear cover. Of course, uses the wonderful image across the top. And most importantly, this has the original mix on the PCM tracks, the Dolby Stereo mix that was specifically designed for Dolby Stereo. And the 5.1 remix completely undoes all the work that they did. So if you want to hear this film and experience it properly, you need to track down a version with the original 2.0 track. One of the DVDs may have that. I may be mistaken, but this presents it beautifully in PCM, and it has a very nice picture transfer. I don't have the Criterion. I've been meaning to pick that one up, but in my experience, the later MGM releases usually are a bit cleaner in picture and sound because MGM had essentially they had better equipment a lot of times. So this is a very nice release, and you can pick it up for very cheap, and it's very well packaged. So next we have Color of Money. This being a Touchstone release, it's essentially a Disney disc. They really didn't put a lot of effort into doing this release, and it's been the same way on DVD and Blu-ray. This film always seems to have a very underwhelming transfer on whatever format you're watching it on. The film was originally matted to 185 in theaters. This is a 133 release. It's very much on the soft side. It's a little hazy, so the picture transfer isn't going to wow you or anything. It does have the original Dolby Stereo mix as PCM, so you can matrix that back out. It sounds better than the DVD. I don't have the Blu-ray to compare, but I have looked at the reviews, and the Blu-ray it's okay. It's not great or anything. But it does, this does give you the original poster artwork on the front. It looks pretty nice in terms of cover and artwork. Touchstone release, so this is a Disney disc. CLV. Not really much to write home about, but if you want the film on Laserdisc, you're going to have to go for this one. And, the sound mix is not the greatest, but at least it's original. So there's that. Next we have the Warner Letterbox release of Goodfellas. This is a rather nice Laserdisc, and of course has the original Dolby Stereo SR mix as PCM 2.0. You can matrix that back out. You have the original poster artwork printed, and it looks quite nice on Laserdisc. It's a regular matte style. It's not glossy, so this is a common title. You can pick it up for pretty cheap. Until the 4K release, this was the 4K master and 4K release, and new restoration and new remastered Blu-ray as well. This transfer was recycled for the first DVD, which was another very early DVD. You had to flip the disc over to finish the film. It's a pretty good Laserdisc transfer. It's kind of analog in feeling. The color's not quite as accurate as the new remastered version, certainly not by a long shot. But this old master got recycled for the DVD, and then the DVD special edition, and then the first Blu-ray still used it, and that was kind of pushing it far beyond its limits. So don't expect a reference transfer or anything, but it does have the original sound mix, which is nice. But the 5.1 remix pretty much preserves the original mix track, so it doesn't really change anything, and it's a fine 5.1 track, but being a purist, I like having the original mix. So and you can pick this up for pretty cheap. So if you want Goodfellas on Laserdisc, this is what you're going to be going for. Next is Scorsese's take on The Age of Innocence, based on the classic Edith Wharton novel. This is a Columbia release, and of course, that means it's quite possible it's rotted. I've played through this. I think it only had a little bit of speckling in some of the side changes, and I think you're pretty okay finding a copy of this without having to worry about rot. But this is a very immaculately photographed film, very beautiful cinematography, and this Laserdisc is pretty good. It has the Dolby Stereo SR track as PCM, no 5.1. Yeah, I don't think it has 5.1, but I think the DVD uses the same transfer, the original DVD, and but now Criterion has put this out on Blu-ray, and it looks quite lovely. This is one of those films where the photography's so good and so lush that you're only going to be able to get so much of that in composite video. But this is a nice disc and uses the original artwork, so you get your chapter listings down here and some nice liner notes, and it looks very nice. Kind of gives you some of the some semblance of the prestige and the that this film carries. It's kind of a forgotten film, but it's a nice watch, and if you've ever had to read any Edith Wharton, you'll instantly know what kind of tone you're in for. Next we have the standard universal letterbox release of Casino. This does not have 5.1. It has a 2.0 matrix track, which sounds quite nice. This is a very good transfer, and it's a common title. You can pick it up for very little. There was a DTS reissue of this, and I'd love to track that down someday, but I'm pretty sure it uses the same transfer. It's CLV, and so is the DTS. Even though this doesn't have 5.1, it's a very nice transfer. I'm sure it was recycled for the very first DVD. You can get the Blu-ray for pretty cheap, which is pretty good. Could be better, and hopefully they do it in 4K at some point. But this is a very nice disc that actually, when I first got into collecting, it was one of the first discs I got, and I used it a lot to do various testing of either moving my speakers around or testing, tweaking around my settings with Video Essentials and stuff. I'll show you the back. So, it's a nice disc to have. I love this film. I'm actually one of the few that prefers it to Goodfellas. And it's a load of fun. And if you haven't seen it in a while, give it another shot. It's just a big, huge, overwhelming, real ball of fun. But yeah, standard style universal jacket. You have their printing of the information here. CLV, and then side 4 is CAV. So at least they give you that. Just wish they had put 5.1 on here, but unfortunately they didn't. But yeah, so that's Casino. That's a pretty common disc. Now we come to a release that is not so common. Go from common to not common. This is the letterbox release of Scorsese's film Kundun. This is a wonderful film that's not talked about very often. From '97. This has a Dolby Matrix track on the digital PCM, and it also has Dolby AC3. Show you the rear. This being a touchstone film, it is a Disney disc, so you can recognize some of the way they always lay their stuff out. Of course, the bottom here is pretty much how all Disney discs were laid out in the '90s. You get a little paragraph blurb about the film here. But I'm pretty sure the DVD was this same master, and then I think it either just came out on Blu-ray or it's about to come on Blu-ray, but it's kind of been neglected for all this time. And I wanted to track down the Laserdisc simply to see what it looked like, because I hadn't seen the film in ages. So I'll be excited to see what this looks like, giving it a spin. Moving on to Ridley Scott. Here we have the letterboxed THX mastered version of Alien. This disc is very important and pretty well known now in enthusiast circles, as the digital PCM track has the original Dolby Stereo mix from 1979, but the 5.1 for making this AC3 track, they actually went out and tracked down a test mix that has a few alternate lines and some differences here and there, but it was actually a test mix done for Sensurround. Fox at the time had been toying with making a deal with the people who owned the Sensurround patent that was developed for Universal on films like Earthquake and such, that had kind of gone defunct by that point, but some theaters still had their Sensurround equipment set up, and they did a whole test mix on Alien. But unfortunately, after they did that, the deal fell through, and Fox just used Dolby for 70 millimeter, which had been successful on Star Wars. So this test mix was never used and never heard, and then placed on here, and it is an incredible listen, and really truly makes it far more terrifying. But of course, it has some differences, so if you've never heard it before, it's not going to be quite the same as what you're used to. And it talks a little about it here. It describes it as being from the 6-track magnetic master used in the 70 millimeter release, but it actually is this alternate test mix. So that's why it's important to track down this release as opposed to simply having the CAV box set. It is a better transfer than the box set, and it also includes that original Dolby Stereo on the PCM. So in terms of picture and audio, it's much better than the box set, but doesn't have the special features from that. So you can actually get this for not too much money. most regular people have no idea about this alternate mix, or they just think it's an AC3 rendering or a 5.1 rendering of that. But that's why it's important to have this. So now we have the Warner's release of the director's cut of Blade Runner. This is an essential Laserdisc title, being the release of the 92 director's cut. It has the 2.0 director's cut mix in PCM, and you can matrix that out in ProLogic, and it's full CAV, so it's a wonderful transfer. It was recycled for the first DVD, and the first DVD in that snapper case from 97 is actually inferior in picture quality. It's slightly cropped and full of noise and compression artifacts, so the Laserdisc is actually better, and has the sound is wonderful because they went back to the original source for picture and sound and simply removed the narration and the original theatrical imposed ending. So this is a very nice transfer of what the elements were like in 92. They've been vaulted properly. So if you ever get the chance to see a print of the director's cut, I think that's the best the film will ever look, regardless of what version it is. The picture and sound quality of the 92 director's cut print is fantastic. And the archival versions on the DVD release and the Blu-ray releases really don't do it justice, because they kind of took the theatrical, the international, and the director's cut and conformed them to an interpositive scan, and it doesn't have the color timing of the theatrical and international releases or the director's cut. The earlier releases were kind of more saturated, whereas the director's cut, they're able to go back to the negative and the interpositives and generate a new one. And with technologies that had advanced in that 10-year span, resulted in prints that were better than the 1982 ones. But anyway, long story short, the Laserdisc is a great rendering of that. It's better than the first DVD. And as far as I'm concerned, I actually think the sound on this is probably the best of any release, because the 5.1 remixes on the archival discs, they're great and all, but the original 1982 mix is different from the director's cut mix, and I think some of the dynamics got tamed out of that 5.1 remix, and it also doesn't have the slight mixing differences of the 1982 mix if you select the 1982 versions on the archival disc. It's all seamlessly branched and kind of conformed to one version. You just have the differences in scenes, and selecting the director's cut doesn't give you the theatrical ending or the narration. So that's why it's nice to have this. Unfortunately, though, this has some of the worst side breaks you'll ever find on Laserdisc. I mean, it's great that it's full CAV. It looks and sounds incredible, but they could have just backed it up a couple seconds here and there to make better side breaks. There's one side break that happens in the middle of a conversation. It makes no sense. I think somebody did not pay attention at all when they were mastering this, because in Chew's laboratory, in the middle of Roy saying his dialogue, you suddenly get disc flip, and it just picks up on the next side. It makes no sense. They could have placed the break right before the scene or right afterwards. It makes no sense. But worst of all is the platter break, when you actually have to change your disc, is right in the middle of chasing Zora through the streets. So it's not. It could be placed much worse. But it's pretty bad. That's probably the worst platter break. You have to get up and change your disc that I've yet encountered on Laserdisc. But, all that aside, those could be a lot worse. But once you get used to it, this is a great release. It's very cheap. It's very common. It belongs in every Laserdisc collection. And I think the only problem with the director's cut is that they didn't have the time to go and locate the original negative materials for the violent moments that were only in the international version. This was based on the US elements, and Warner Brothers gave them no time. Ridley Scott had to be involved by memos because he was still working on Thelma and Louise. Warner Brothers gave them like literally a week or two and no time at all and no budget. So unfortunately, this is still based around the 1982 US theatrical release, so you missed those little snippets of violence. But that is the only thing that I think hurts the director's cut. So, but anyway, irregardless, if you don't have this and you only have the Criterion, or you don't have any Blade Runner on Laserdisc, grab this one. It is essential. It is a great Laserdisc, aside from those kind of crappy side breaks. So next we have the Paramount letterbox release of Ridley Scott's Black Rain. Got the original poster artwork here. It's not a bad transfer, but it is an older one, kind of like how Last Crusade is an older transfer. So, of course, the DVD is a lot better. The Blu-ray is not really that great, but I do like the gatefold. They just use stills from the film. It looks very nice. Of course, it looks very 80s. The stylization of this movie is really what you watch it for. Here's the rear cover, very standard Paramount jacket. Has the original Dolby Stereo mix on the PCM tracks. However, I do believe this film was blown up to 70 millimeters, so there should be a 6-track mix. So later releases with 5.1 would probably be based around that. This is a nice transfer, a nice disc, and nice artwork, very standard Paramount letterbox release, and it's nice to have. Usually you find the pan and scan version very often, but the letterbox is kind of hard to find. Next we have the letterbox reissue of Thelma and Louise from MGM. This adds a Scott commentary, alternate scenes, and bonus footage at the end, and it also adds a 5.1 AC3 remix. Unfortunately, though, at this time, MGM was they goofed this one up. If you look on the LDDB listing, it talks about how the 5.1 on this is missing effects and lines of dialogue and such, and but the Dolby on the PCM tracks, the Dolby Surround mix, which was the original theatrical mix, anyway, is unaffected and just like the previous letterbox release. So you just stick with that. And I haven't really done an A/B comparison, but if somebody says that, I'm pretty sure that's the way it is. And I also noticed on License to Kill, it was supposed to come out on Laserdisc in a reissue as part of the reissue series, and that got canceled, and then they later showed up as the special edition DVDs, and that's where the 5.1 mix first appeared for License to Kill. But if you compare that to the MGM reissue letterbox version on Laserdisc with the original 2.0 Dolby SR track, there's some mixed differences, and there's some effects and a little bits here and there that are not on the 5.1. So since I've had firsthand experience with that, I can totally believe them having problems in mastering 5.1 remixes. And apparently there's a couple other titles where that happened on. So here's the gatefold. Nice gatefold though. And you get some liner, a little paragraph, and you get your chapter headings. Two sides CLV, and then the third side is CAV with the ending of the film, and then your bonus features. The Ridley Scott commentary is on the analog track, so you can switch to that if you like. I believe that's been preserved on all the DVDs and such. Nice back art, nice release. Not easy to find because it is a later re-release. I think it's from 97 or 98 maybe, but the original letterbox release is pretty common, but I just thought it was nice to pick that up. But you do have to keep in mind to just stick with the digital tracks. Here's the letterbox release of White Squall. It does have Dolby AC3. It's a Disney disc, so it's pretty bare bones and has some of their usual logos and designs. But it does look pretty good for a mid-90s disc. Yeah, of course, Hollywood Pictures, so it is a Disney disc. I haven't got to spin this yet, but I have heard it has a nice transfer and a really great AC3 track, so that should be interesting to crank up. I think the Blu-ray you can get very, very cheap. I think it's on Mill Creek, so Mill Creek usually goes for, Mill Creek releases are usually very cheap, so I might pick up the Blu-ray too to compare. All right. So moving on to Spielberg. Here we have the Universal letterbox release of Sugarland Express, which is a great film that people don't talk about enough. I think it's one of Spielberg's best films. And basically, if you took elements of Duel and elements of this film and mixed them together, you got a lot of what made Jaws so successful. This was the first letterbox release. It's a very nice transfer. It has the original mono as PCM, and of course the original poster artwork. Unfortunately, when this film came out, it was kind of mishandled and mislabeled. Most people thought it was a comedy, and then when they watched it, it was so dramatic, and Goldie Hawn wasn't making you have a laugh riot. They started to kind of scratch their heads, and that helped it to not be very successful at the box office, and it wasn't marketed very well either. But it is a very good film, got some very good critical notices, and you do see elements of Spielberg all throughout this, even though it's technically only his second feature. I still think it's one of his best, and I wish it was more well known. It did come out on Blu-ray recently as part of the Spielberg Collection. That is a very nice HD transfer. I have seen this in on a 35mm print as a part of a double feature, and it looks great on the big screen. It's very inventive in its scope photography, even a lot of handheld scope work, which was very uncommon for a 1970s film. This has a lot of European influence, and it's kind of interesting to see a Spielberg film with touches of what you expect from Spielberg, but before he was really established, so it takes a lot more chances, and that's really another reason why I like it so much. So it's a very underrated, great film, and very nice Laserdisc. So this is the standard Universal letterbox release of Jaws, I think from 1991. Of course, with the rating logo and the maybe too intense for children, but that doesn't stop children from watching it. Nice transfer, not as good as the 95 CAV signature release, of course. And the other thing to note is that this is the partially rescored for home video version. As you can see right here, some of the source music on the beach and some of the beach scenes was replaced. And also when they did that, and whenever they did that with a lot of titles, they kind of would go in and have to mess with some of the levels and the EQ and the balance and things. So it's not the same as the original mono track that is untouched on the signature release. So if you have this and you didn't know that, you have to get the signature release for the original mono. And the DVD reissue and the Blu-ray have the original mono, but the best sounding release is still the signature box set. So nothing in special features except for the original trailer. It's a pretty nice CLV transfer, but it is, a bit hazier, and the color is not as good as the signature disc, but it's not bad, and you can get this one for very cheap. So I think I paid like $1 for this. So, and it's a very nice usage of original production stills and using the whole back to really give you a sense of the open waters. Next we have the Universal release of Always, Spielberg's remake of A Guy Named Joe. Has the original Dolby Stereo track as PCM. This did get a 70mm release, so 5.1 versions would be derived from that. Nice picture transfer, very good soundtrack, because coming from anything Spielberg related in the late 80s, they were always pushing the boundaries of what you could do technically. It's kind of a forgotten film. I haven't seen it in a long while, so I'm going to be interested to crank this up and see what it looks like. But nice usage of the jacket, and got it in good shape, and it's a relatively common title. Now we have the Universal Letterbox release of Schindler's List. This did get the THX stamp of approval and has a Dolby Matrix stereo surround track as PCM. It does not have 5.1. Of course, you have the original poster artwork and the typical Universal layout. Unlike most discs, though, this does have sort of a Unipack style gatefold. You open it up like this, and your discs are actually in here like the old Unipacks on certain vinyl record releases, like The Doors' Waiting for the Sun, for example. So these can be a little awkward to deal with, but it's a different type of design, and sort of another marker of how they tried to treat this film with some element of prestige even on this standard version. Got your chapters spread across 4 sides. no special features or anything really. The box set, as far as I can tell, the big box set of Schindler's List is essentially this same disc release, and then I think, if I remember correctly, I think it includes the soundtrack CD or something, and maybe some lithographs and printed materials. So it's kind of one of those Laserdisc box sets that really was just like a puffed up standard release. So if you find this and you want to see what it looks like on Laserdisc, you know, you can grab this and you don't have to worry about getting the box set. It's a very nice standard definition transfer. It looks very good, and it's very interesting to see how much they got into a composite transfer, kind of like Private Ryan later on. You know, how much they got across in standard definition. So nice disc. And, you know, it's nice to have, even though, of course, the HD versions are going to have a lot more impact and look a lot better as black and white. So there's that release. Next we have the Laserdisc release of Saving Private Ryan. Very interesting late disc release. Pretty hard to come by on Laserdisc, and a lot of people try and track it down because not only is it a late release, but it has a 5.1 Dolby AC3 track that a lot of people want to compare and contrast to other versions in the hope that it might sound better. Of course, this film is infamous among home theater circles and film circles for having a very intensive sound mix originally in the theater, and a lot of people swear by one video version or another that it's the best rendition of that audio track. I've done some comparisons, but they all sound pretty similar to me. You can't really go wrong with any release. However, don't go into this expecting it to be a fantastic looking late release Laserdisc. I mean, it is for what it is, but this is also a very complicated film to transfer. And it's amazing how much they got into this composite video transfer, but it's also not as easy to watch as, say, the DVD or especially the Blu-ray, and the 4K version's upcoming, so that should be interesting. But it's a very nicely put together Laserdisc. Pretty simple though. It's an image release. It did get a THX mastering stamp. It does have the aforementioned Dolby 5.1 AC3, which sounds excellent. It also has a PCM Matrix version on the digital tracks, which is also a fine listen. Of course, it's nowhere near as good as the 5.1 due to not having discrete channels. No special features or anything. This being a late release, actually I do believe this came out in 1999. I think they planned a DTS version and that just never came to pass. And then the first DVDs, you had to choose between either having the Dolby version or the DTS version. So it is what it is, and it can get expensive on Laserdisc. I happened to find this for pretty cheap from a seller, so I figured I'd give it a shot. It's a nice disc to have, as having one of the last releases here in the United States. You know, it's a fine disc, but you know, it's not a reference quality late release in terms of picture. It is a reference quality in terms of sound, however. That's not to say the picture transfer is bad by any means. It's actually quite great, and it's wonderful to see how good they got at doing composite transfers by this point in time, but it's definitely a film that's served better by having at least a component master on DVD, if not HD. So that's the Private Ryan release. It's pretty plain, pretty bare bones. So, all right, moving on to George Stevens. This is the Special Collector's Edition reissue of Gunga Din, the classic adventure film from 1939. Beautiful cover artwork from one of the pivotal scenes of the film. And I do like how they kind of gave it almost a slight sepia tinge to really give it that timeless quality, because it is a timeless film. This is superior to the older RKO collection release. It may be the same transfer, but this one's a lot cleaner. And of course, you get all kinds of extra features and nice packaging and everything. It's got a gatefold, which looks like this. Get tons of liner notes about the film and the whole essay Criterion style. And then you get a list of director George Stevens' various film credits, and then more about Stevens himself. Nice usage of production stills. And then your chapter index, CLV, and then Side 3 CAV has documentary pieces narrated by George Stevens Jr., which are very nice and very worth your time. These were recycled for the DVD. The DVD essentially recycles this exact Laserdisc, but of course it doesn't have any of this wonderful packaging, and it doesn't really promote itself as being a special edition. And here's the rear cover, done by Image with the Turner Home Entertainment banner. So this is a later 90s release. You can get a little bit of blurb about the film, the original one sheet here. And yeah, this is one of the great classic adventure films. I mean, it's the definition of classic adventure film. And a lot of materials inspired, a lot of materials in this inspired Temple of Doom, which I was pleasantly shocked to see when I finally got to see this, because I was already very familiar with Temple of Doom, of course. And Ben Burtt and other people at Lucasfilm are big fans of Gunga Din. So, of course, that always helps. And hopefully Warner Archive does this on Blu-ray, because it would be stunning to see. The DVD is a bit cleaner than the transfer on this, but it is really nice to see a great classic black and white film treated well on Laserdisc. And even though it has some age-related wear and tear, I think it's always kind of interesting to see classics that way, because, you know, for lack of a better term, it feels more vintage in such a way. But this or the DVD, you can't go wrong. And the older disc is fine as well. I don't own the older disc currently, but you know, just this is a nice release to have if you come across it. So next we have the Columbia Classics release of Stevens' screwball comedy, The More the Merrier, 1943, a rarer wartime screwball comedy. And it has quite a bit of drama inherent too, and a very nice emotional tone, I think, due to it being a wartime film. So it makes it a little bit different than your typical screwball comedy. And it's really great, and it's quite sad it's not talked about as much as some of the others. Very nice release. The same the same print source was used for the DVD, so you get the better sound on this because it has the mono as PCM on the digital tracks. Has the standard Columbia Classics video jacket. You do get a nice bit of notes about the film in the original one sheet, but other than that, no special features, pretty plain. But this is a great little gem of a picture, and you know, hopefully it gets done for Blu-ray at some point. There have been a number of Gene Arthur pictures that have actually come to Blu-ray on various different labels, and it'd be nice for this to get a really nice HD transfer, because it would look great. There's really great photography in here, classic black and white photography, and how can anybody say no to more Gene Arthur on Blu-ray? So next we have the MGM letterbox release, Greatest Story Ever Told. This is the big biblical epic George Stevens did in 1965, and unfortunately it's been subject to a number of pretty poor video transfers. The DVD wasn't great, the Blu-ray is pretty crummy, so if you watch this on DVD or Blu-ray, you're going to wonder how in the heck this was a big, large-scale 70mm Ultra Panavision movie, because it doesn't look like it. Which is really a shame, because years of effort and tons of money and time went into making this. And even though I'm not one for biblical films normally, you know, when you can't ignore that amount of time, money, and effort. This is a pretty nice Laserdisc, and it is a very long film. It's over 3 hours, if I remember correctly. Yeah, 3 hours, 19 minutes. And it does have a nice gatefold, and I saw it for nothing in the bin, so I figured I'd pick it up and give it a shot. So it's a pretty nice Laserdisc, and I'm pretty sure these same materials were reused for the DVD and Blu-ray. Of course, MGM's now under different ownership, so they really don't put any money into their transfers, unfortunately. And this one really needs like at least a 6K or an 8K scan to get that large format negative transferred properly. This actually is a very good, you know, a very good piece of workmanship. You know, it's really a big epic, and it deserves much better treatment on home video. But as far as the Laserdisc is concerned, it's actually a very nice release. It has the original 70mm 6-track mixed down into Dolby Surround Pro Logic on the digital tracks, so it sounds nice. Not really much to complain about. It pretty much, you get what you get. Nothing in terms of special features or anything, but you know, it's a nice MGM letterbox release from the time period of a film that really, really, really deserves better treatment on the more modern releases. Next, we'll move on to John Sturges. Here's the MGM letterbox release of Bad Day at Black Rock. Criterion did a version that includes a very famous John Sturges commentary, which you can actually find online some places, and it's a fantastic listen. But unfortunately, that's a rare Criterion, and other than the commentary, it's bare bones. It's one of their CLV discs, so I haven't found that yet to do transfer comparisons. It's also supposed to contain a mono track, whereas this contains the original 4-track stereo CinemaScope mix mixed down into Pro Logic on the digital tracks. And it sounds wonderful. There's some real stereo separation and some directional dialogue here and there, which is always great. So that indicates it is the original mix. I'll show you the back. Nice usage of artwork. It doesn't really have any special features. It's pretty much a movie-only transfer. But it's a very nice transfer for the time, has very good color. And of course, this film being one of the best usages of CinemaScope in the early days, it's nice to see a proper letterbox transfer. Seeing this film in pan and scan is a travesty. Ironically, Sturges mentions in that Criterion commentary that they did shoot a 133 Academy version because this was at the time where CinemaScope was still seen as more of a fad, and they didn't know if it was going to last, so they were trying to protect themselves. But apparently that version was never released or never finished that way because they quickly realized the scope version worked perfectly, and the widescreen compositions really showed off the arid desert locations. And of course, if you haven't seen this film, do so immediately. It's an American classic. This MGM release is actually a very nice release, but it's now out on Blu-ray on a lovely HD scan from Warner Archive. Here we have the MGM letterbox release of The Great Escape. Also another title that was done by Criterion, and I do have that one. That's a much more extensive special edition, which I'll cover in my Criterion video. But what's interesting about this release, and why I wanted to pick it up, this release actually exposes the entire picture negative, whatever source they scanned. It's actually ultra wide. It's showing you more picture information than was ever originally intended to be seen. So, and it was also, this master was transferred for the first DVD, which is the same way. If you look at that one, it's got like this ultra wide, like 2.6 or 2.5 ratio or something. And every version after that has gone back to the regular 2.35. So that's why it's nice to have this. It's a different version. You see more picture information than you do on the other releases. And it has the original mono mix as PCM on the digital tracks, and it sounds a tad cleaner than the Criterion version. I think the source was also different than the Criterion as well, but that one's a little bit older. So as usual, the MGM release is usually a little bit technically better due to being a couple years newer in terms of the actual transfer date. Standard release style for them. It's got a gatefold showcasing the famous motorcycle jump, which is very nicely done across the whole gatefold. In fact, it looks so great, I kind of wish they hadn't included their usual bit of production stills here and there. But still, it's very nice and very perfect use of the gatefold on a Laserdisc. There's no better image you could use for that, really. Here's the back. Kind of similar to other MGM releases. I picked this up simply for the different transfer, so I didn't really mind that it had a bit of damage and stuff, but you can get this one for very cheap. If you're a fan of the film, you'll probably want to have it to have the mono mix and have the wider transfer version. But you can also pick up the old original MGM DVD if you want to have it on digital. Unfortunately, the new Blu-ray was subject to a new scan and has some well, I guess you could say interesting issues of color timing. There are many shots that don't quite look right, and there were some instances where a lot of fans decried the perhaps modern usage of teal and other quote colors that started to creep in. So the Blu-ray is a bit of a mixed bag in that regard. It could be better, and I do kind of think the color is a little bit iffy, but still, if you're interested in Great Escape on Laserdisc, you'll actually want this MGM release and the Criterion version. The Criterion for its exclusive extras and commentary and packaging, and this version for this different transfer and a slightly cleaner version of the mono mix. So. Next we have Sturge's The Hallelujah Trail from MGM again, letterboxed, 70mm release with the original audio mixed into Dolby Surround and as PCM on the digital tracks. Very nice release. Has a gatefold. Show you the panels. Nice usage of the whole gatefold for the horizon image on the bottom there. This is kind of a forgotten film. It's a very interesting one, but sadly it was put out on DVD as a port of this Laserdisc, and then that one, got kind of harder to find and expensive, and it's just been released on Blu-ray, but it's that same old master again, and that's not doing anybody any favors. So I went ahead and picked this up when I saw it in the bins for cheap, simply because I wanted to see it again. And for a big, large format film, it's kind of a shame it's stuck with crummy video transfers. But this is a nice Laserdisc for the time, and it's still, it's almost just as good as the DVD. It has better sound than the DVD. I don't have the Blu-ray yet, but of course, since it's not a very good Blu-ray, it's kind of lower down on my totem pole. So the Laserdisc will do fine for now. Next we have Sturge's Ice Station Zebra. MGM letterbox release. Very interesting, and again, another kind of forgotten picture in this day and age. It's a kind of a mixture of a spy film, a war film, a commando film. So it's like if you kind of mixed 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea with The Dirty Dozen with one of the many 60s spy knockoff films. So it's kind of an odd beast in that way, and it does have the sense of an epic because of the epic length. So it's very interesting, definitely worth a watch at least once. This is an older Laserdisc transfer, but it's well done. It's a good element, and it has the original sound transferred, mixed through into Dolby Surround as digital on the as PCM on the digital tracks. Get your gatefold, nice gatefold, and I like how they centered the image, so it gives a sense of scale. There's the left panel, production stills, the right panel with the original one sheet. This was later reissued on DVD by Warner much later on, and they did an HD scan which looks much better, and that's now come out on Blu-ray, which again in turn looks even better than the DVD. Could be better if they did a 4K scan, but I don't think this film is popular enough to warrant one, sadly. But anyway, here's the rear cover, standard MGM style, but it's a nice Laserdisc and it's a nice release. If you haven't seen the film before or haven't seen it in a while, definitely pick this up. It's not as common as other MGM discs. I'm hoping to get the Blu-ray soon just to check that out, because it has the sound in 5.1 discrete, but this actually sounds quite nice even though it's only matrixed. Now we have Truffaut's The Wild Child. This is a very nice late MGM release, of course in French with English subtitles that are printed in. Letterboxed, it's got the usual later MGM release letterbox graphic. That's how you can always tell that, and the more CGI style MGM lion logo. I do like the cover artwork, and I do believe this was all recycled for the DVD release. I think that's also the same master as well. Here's the rear. Distributed through Image, so they have their logo there. CLV, two-sided, a little bit of explanation, but pretty much a movie-only disc. But Not very common since it's not only a French film, but a late release from MGM. So I was excited to find this. I haven't got to watch it yet, but I'm sure it's the same as the DVD they did. All their Truffaut DVDs seem to be pretty similar or based off of older masters. Now we have the RKO Turner Home Entertainment Image release of Citizen Kane under the RKO Classic banner. It's got the wonderful cover with the mock-up of the Daily Enquirer with the film title and information then being contained as a faux news article. I think the cover alone makes this disc worth owning. Of course, it's nothing compared to the Criterion re-release in terms of special features and commentary and such. But this is a nice release. It is a good transfer. Of course, it's far better than the first VHS copy I owned, which I do believe was from this same thing. They had the various VHS releases that came out in the 80s and 90s. And the motif of the front cover continues onto the back, which I thought was really clever. And you can get this disc for far cheaper than the Criterion. So it does have the original mono as PCM. And of course, it's a nice, beautiful transfer of a classic, and the only other good transfer besides Laserdisc is the current Blu-ray, which is great and looks stunning. You have to skip that DVD though, because that was done by Lowry Digital here in the United States, and they overzealously applied noise reduction, so it's kind of infamous among video circles, along with some of the other early Lowry Digital titles that they handled, for being too overzealously cleaned up. So, and let me make sure. I can't remember if this had the other commentary. One image release had its own commentary that was different from the Criterion commentary. I can't remember if this one has that commentary or not. I don't think it does. No, it doesn't. But there is another commentary on an image release that's different from the Criterion Laserdisc commentary. Next, we have the RKO Classic release of Wells's The Stranger. For the longest time, this was the best official release you could get of the film because it was kind of in a semi-public domain state. Most of the copies are the usual cheapo bin, crappy public domain copies from various sources that would be of terrible quality or missing bits here and there, or made from 16mm reduction elements or TV syndication prints. It was just a mess. So there's now 2 DVD versions that are very good, and now there's at least 3 Blu-ray editions that are all very good, but all have their own pluses and minuses and different sets of extras. So if you really want a complete version of the film, you wind up having to get 3 Blu-rays. But still, if you're interested in the best release on Laserdisc, this is the only one. It does have the original mono mix as PCM. It is a harder to find title, so I was very happy to find this. And I like the usage of vintage production still as the full Laserdisc jacket artwork. I think the layout looks very well and looks very good on here with the typeface from the original one sheet. Here's the rear cover, which looks very nice, being almost completely in black and white with only the red to distinguish it a bit. No special features or anything, but it's a nice release, not very common. And until the MGM DVD and then the 3 Blu-rays, this was the best release you could get on any format for the longest time. So it's a nice disc to have. Moving on to Billy Wilder. This is the old Universal Critics' Choice version of Double Indemnity. Of course, it's an older analog disc. This was later released as an encore edition without Gene Shalit all over the cover. That always kind of cracked me up. It's like, yes, I like Gene Shalit at all, but I don't really want him on my movie release, so I have to stare at the same odd photo montage of Gene Shalit whenever I want to watch a movie. But anyway, the later encore disc I think is identical to this. This one is analog sound only, no digital tracks. I think there was a later release, either the Encore or the last release did have digital sound, and then Image did the first DVD, and then the film was out of print for many years, so it wasn't until Universal put out their eventual legacy DVD and now the Blu-ray that it came back into print. It's a pretty nice transfer. It's a little soft, it's a little hazy, and like most black and white films on the older analog disc, you know, the soundtrack is going to be very noisy and the film's going to kind of look a little bit washed out, but you know, it's vintage and of its time, and you know, for all that considered, it actually still looks and sounds pretty good. It's definitely watchable. If you want a copy of Double Indemnity on Laserdisc, and you know, you see this or the Encore version for cheap, you know, you might as well pick it up for a couple bucks. You know, it's not a bad release, but it's nothing compared to the DVD or even especially the Blu-ray. The Blu-ray is a must-own and pretty dirt cheap. Sorry, this is another disc that came from my old professor, so I'm having to cover up his old address here. Standard style, old school Universal back cover. You do have 2 stills that have been colorized. I don't know if those were from original color stills or, well, I'm sure they probably were. I don't think they were paying for colorization of stills on video rear covers. 2-sided, and of course you don't get any chapters, although they jokingly list chapter 1 on side 2 as going straight to the theatrical trailer at the end. So if you want chapters, you simply skip the second half of the movie. But it does include the trailer, which is a nice touch. So that's the old release of Double Indemnity. Next, we have the MGM letterbox release of Billy Wilder's Witness for the Prosecution. This is a stupendous looking Laserdisc. I was quite surprised how good it looks. Black and white, of course. The black and white really jumps off, especially on a CRT. Very good. Has the original mono as PCM on the digital track, so it looks and sounds excellent. The DVD was a port of this, and now Kino has done a Blu-ray, which is from the MGM source and looks and sounds great. But this is a very nice Laserdisc, and you know, if you've never seen the film, this is definitely worth picking up. It is a great classic based on the famous Agatha Christie stage play. It's kind of more forgotten nowadays among Wilder's canon, but it's definitely worth revisiting every once in a while. Of course, once you know kind of the denouement of the mystery, you know, you kind of want to wait a while before you see it again. But it's beautifully photographed, beautifully staged, beautifully played by a great cast, and beautifully put together. And this is a very, very nice looking Laserdisc. Like I said, I was quite surprised, and the DVD was just a port of it, so you can see why. Now we have the letterbox release of The Apartment from MGM as well. The original mono mix is PCM. The reason why you do want to have this disc is it does have the best rendering of the mono mix. I do have the current Arrow Blu-ray. It took me a while to get the current Arrow Blu-ray, and it looks stunning, and it fixes the aspect ratio issue of the previous MGM Blu-ray, but unfortunately it does have some issue with having the mono a bit too over scrubbed. So if you want the best sounding release, you still want this or the old MGM DVD, which was a port of this. It is letterbox. You do get the full 235 framing. It does have a beautiful gatefold. Here you have how MGM used to split their gatefolds, where they had one side with some stills kind of scattered around, kind of with some dead space, and then the whole other panel with an image from the film, this being the famous instance of the tennis racket turned pasta strainer, which basically is about my level of cooking skills. Here's the rear. They were kind of trying to go with more of a prestige feel for this, which you can kind of get from the top banner being actual not only gold colored, but actually has that sheen to it that they did on their more prestige letterbox releases. But other than that, you know, nothing in terms of special features. I think it does have the theatrical trailer at the end, but it's a very nice Laserdisc, and you can get it for very cheap. And of course, if you've never seen this film, what are you doing with your life? This is one of Wilder's all-time masterpieces. It swept the Oscars with good reason, and it is one of the American classics. So, see it immediately. Next we have Billy Wilder's 1, 2, 3. This is the harder to find later release MGM letterbox disc. There was an earlier version from Image, but MGM came around and did this version much later in the late 90s, so it's very hard to find. The same master is used for the DVD, and now it's out on Blu-ray from Kino, which looks the best, but one would hope they'd do a 4K scan of it someday. This is a very, very extremely fast-paced comedy. Jimmy Cagney basically has to bend over backwards the whole film to keep up with it, and he does. I don't think anybody else could have. It's an incredible performance, incredibly witty and biting satire in the times of the Cold War, and all about the ups and downs of being a Pepsi Cola salesman in Berlin at the time. Sounds kind of ridiculous, but this actually is it's both hysterical and full of biting, cynical satire at the same time. It really deserves to be better known, I think, in this day and age. Has the original mono mix as PCM on the digital tracks, and then it does have the isolated score on the analog track, and has a analog right track, and then the analog left track has another rendering of the mono soundtrack. So that's a nice reason to have this if you're interested in the isolated score. But this is a very nice transfer, and like I said, it was recycled for the DVD, and but it is a great film, and I wish it was better known. Same thing with this film. This is Wilder's The Fortune Cookie, MGM letterbox release. Fortunately, this one was price clipped, but still, it's in pretty good shape. This is another dark comedy that's insanely well put together, insanely funny, but also very dramatic. And only the way Billy Wilder could do. So it's another that deserves to be better known. Here you have the gatefold. Again, you have the MGM style of using one side with stills, and the other side has stills and the original door poster there, which is a nice touch. Letterboxed release, the original mono on the digital tracks is PCM. This same master is recycled for the DVD, and now I do believe it's out of Blu-ray if I'm remembering correctly. But this is another one that, if you give it a chance, you'll be pleasantly surprised. And of course, with the pairing of Lemon and Mathau, how can you go wrong? But it does have a very wicked sense of dark humor. And I think when modern audiences see some of these lesser-known Wilder films in this day and age, they tend to get them a bit better, because this film, like some of his others, well, many of his others on the original release, really didn't get a fair shake. So I think they were really quite ahead of their time in a lot of ways. So, speaking of misunderstood, here we have probably Wilder's most misunderstood film, and one that was butchered upon its original release by the studio. This is The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, the Letterbox Collector's Edition, done by Image. This was the first release to try and at least represent the missing sections that were ripped out of this film that unfortunately no longer exist in their complete forms. This was Wilder's epic roadshow retelling of the life and times of Sherlock Holmes, but not using any of the original Conan Doyle short stories, instead creating his own with I.A.L. Diamond, his own recollection of what Holmes must have been like had he been a real human being. So it's full of wicked humor, dark irony, and a real love and dedication to the original Conan Doyle stories. So even though it takes complete liberty with everything, it also doesn't at the same time. It's an odd beast. And even as a diehard Holmes purist, this is without a doubt the finest film version of Holmes ever put together, even though it really has nothing to do with Conan Doyle or any of the original stories. And unfortunately, it was intended to be seen as a roadshow epic with multiple episodes that each give you a different flavor of what Holmes must have been like as a man. But at least 2 whole sequences were ripped out, and this was documented here in this release rather extensively. The producers of this disc really went to great lengths to try and recreate, or at least represent, what was missing. And here you have a description of the original vision with the different sequences kind of blocked out so you could see what they were supposed to look like. And the theatrical version of the film plays out, and then it goes into another side with some text commentary, and then it explains before launching into the 2 segments. It is able to represent. Unfortunately, one exists only in picture form, and the other exists only in audio form. So it's sad that they don't exist in their entirety, but you do get a sense of what the original film was to have been like. These were all recycled for the MGM DVD, which unfortunately doesn't include any of this wonderful text information or liner notes or anything, but all that stuff is on there. And all that stuff is on the Kino Blu-ray, which essentially ports all that to, ports that same transfer and everything to 1080p. Unfortunately, you know, I wish it would be better. Eureka has just released it in the UK on their Masters of Cinema label, and that one seems to be a little bit better encoded. So if you want the best Blu-ray, you want the Eureka version. But unfortunately, it's never been scanned at 4K with a new scan. If it was, it would look beautiful. The photography of this film is very, very, very intricate, and it really does give a sense of the time period of Holmes and everything, and the sets were designed to be big and expansive and really feel as if they're lived in. This is a pretty good Laserdisc transfer. It could be better. It's a bit soft and hazy, but that's due to the some of the diffusion used in the photography originally. And the color palette was designed to be a certain way, so it's not the most overtly colorful of films. The DVD is a bit better because you get the better resolution, and the Blu-ray is a bit better than that because you get 1080p resolution, but it is an older master and really deserves better. This is a great film. This is a masterwork, and I wish someday the missing pieces could be found in better shape, and I wish more people knew about this film. It is a great film. If you're a Holmes fan, if you've never seen this, definitely give it a shot. If you're not a Holmes fan, give it a shot anyway, because Billy Wilder was a genius. So, moving on to Robert Wise. This is the later MGM release of Odds Against Tomorrow. This is a very nice release, glossy cover. It's a later release and rather very uncommon. I was quite happy to find this. It's now out on Blu-ray, and it's a nice transfer, but I just thought it was nice to have this, since it's very nice to find later release classics, as they didn't release too many classics in the last days of Laserdisc. Standard later style MGM back. You do get the original mono mix as PCM on the digital tracks. On the analog tracks, you get an isolated music and effects score track, which is nice. You do get one of the little MGM factoid boxes, but other than the theatrical trailer at the end, there's no special features. So it's a very nice disc, nice transfer. So always nice to find those later releases. And we have the Universal Letterbox release of the Andromeda Strain. Great classic sci-fi thriller that Robert Wise did based on the Michael Crichton novel. Nice Laserdisc, great letterbox transfer, has the original mono as PCM on the digital tracks. Standard style Universal back, but it's a nice Laserdisc, not very expensive. The film's now out on Blu-ray, but you know, when you got a great Laserdisc and it's only $1 or $2, you might as well give it a shot. Next we move on to William Wyler's version of Wuthering Heights. This is a Pioneer Special Edition, beautifully packaged with this black cover and the nice kind of bronzing of the title. This is still sealed. I haven't got to open this up yet, but I was actually quite happy to find this still in perfect shape. It's the original price tag on it for $44.99. We've come a long way, haven't we? Has the original mono mix as PCM on the digital tracks. Has a lovely bit of text information. Has information about the transfer, talking about maximizing the NTSC transfer regulations for Laserdisc. And then, I can't remember if this has a... Yes, it does have Alfred Newman's score isolated on the analog track. And then I do believe it does have a spattering of special features, but all in all, it's a very nice later Pioneer Special Edition release, so it was nice to find this. And it goes very well with the next disc, the Pioneer Special Edition release of Wyler's The Best Years of Our Lives, which is the great classic post-war drama that really, you know, it does hold up very well, and you can see why it swept the Oscars. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to give it a shot. It's definitely better than all of its imitators, even its modern imitators. And it does hold up very well. This is a very nice Laserdisc release. Gatefold jacket. Here you have your chapter listings. It does have some supplementary content, some interviews. And here's some notes here. They're actually continued from the back jacket, so the liner notes start on the back jacket here and then spill over. Gives you a listing of the actual awards and Oscars it won, which is actually quite nice. Includes a listing of the special features here. Includes the original score isolated on the analog track. Has a restored version of the mono original mix as PCM on the digital tracks. That's for interviews and supplementary text features and the original trailer. So it's a nice release to have. Very nicely packaged. I like the usage of the white background to contrast with the black background on Wuthering Heights. And next we have Wyler's The Big Country. This is the letterboxed collector's edition from MGM. This has a number of special features that were never ported over to DVD. It has a commentary, some text information, some interview pieces, and unfortunately the Blu-ray MGM put out had a really bad aspect ratio problem. They mistakenly tried to process it, I guess, as a CinemaScope film, an early one with the squeezing problem, and applied it to this film, which was not shot CinemaScope, and so the resulting MGM Blu-ray has a really bad aspect ratio problem and is really unwatchable, despite being a nice scan technically. Kino picked up the rights to that, and their version got delayed when they realized that was an issue, and they're supposed to be coming out with it this year, and hopefully all that is fixed. But it's still a great classic Western that, unfortunately, like other classic Westerns, is not discussed much anymore at length, which is a real shame, because the great American Westerns are a lost art form and should be respected properly. Lovely release with this gatefold. Tons of wonderful text information here. You get an interview piece here. You get these wonderful liner notes, a huge essay, Criterion style. And then you get more information over here with the chapter indexes and an index of the supplementary content. Get information on the analog tracks, the commentary, and then the interview pieces and how it's broken down. Very extensive information for an MGM disc, much like that release of Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. Like that one, this is also distributed through Image. Get a nice bit of information about the technical specs of the disc on the back. Nice usage of color, and it's a little bit more busy, but it's much more pleasing than the standard regular style MGM rear cover. So there's the rear cover. And last, for the director's shelf, we have the letterboxed original release of Wyler's Ben-Hur from 1959. This is a wonderful disc, that very important as it was the first major letterbox release of this film, which is very important due to it being Ultra Panavision 70 and having an original aspect ratio of 2.76 to 1. If there's any film that it should be a crime for it to be ever pan and scanned, one would be Lawrence of Arabia, but Ben-Hur is probably even worse due to it being so exceptionally wide. Of course, at the time, they couldn't really master something that wide for televisions of the time, or telecines, or transfers. So this release is much closer to what you would have seen on 35mm prints as 2.35 to 1. I think it may be a little bit wider than that. I think it does get pretty close, because the Blu-ray restoration is absolutely breathtaking. But I put this in immediately thereafter, and I was quite surprised. On a good system with good equipment, this cleans up exceptionally well and looks outstanding for being a disc from, I think, about 1991. Of course, it was later released as a CAV reissue anniversary box set, which I have. We'll go over that in the box set video. But and it's come out on DVD, and they finally got it to the full 2.76 width on the 4-disc DVD, and then the Blu-ray for the new HD scan. But for what this is and what the time it came out, it's an exceptional Laserdisc, and if you don't have it, pick it up, because it's very cheap. But it also contains the original Oscar-winning, Academy Award-winning audio mix, which had tons of directional dialogue and tons of a new style of sound effects mixing, which really predated the modern style of mixing in sound effects. So it's very important for its time, technically and historically. And unfortunately, Warner saw fit to remix the film to put and lock all of the dialogue and effects in the center channel and take out all of the sound panning, which is very important and integral to the way they used to mix for 70mm large format road shows, and this film took that to another level. So if you want to hear the original mix, you need this disc. Unfortunately, they had to put it through Dolby, so it's just a matrixed 2.0 track as PCM. It sounds great, has full dynamic range and fidelity, but unfortunately it's not discrete. I haven't been able to compare every single version since, all the various DVDs, but the Blu-ray is definitely remixed. I think the remix was done for the later Laserdisc. I haven't had time to do a direct comparison of this to the box set. I think they're overall similar. But this is a stunning looking release once you clean it up and you get it going and stuff, and perfectly watchable. A great Laserdisc of a very hard to transfer classic film. Nice gatefold as well. Here's the left panel. There's the right panel. So you can open the Laserdisc and think about rowing with the rest of the galley slaves. And here's the rear. All this artwork was reused for the double VHS release. So you'll probably be familiar with the way this looks if you saw Ben-Hur as a kid. But otherwise pretty standard, no special features or anything, but this was their first attempt to try and really get the film right. And they did succeed for, a 1991 release. This is a very well put together Laserdisc for the time. So anyway, that concludes the director's shelf. We're going to move on to the smaller but still substantial shelf I have for some favorite actors and stuff. So stay tuned.